Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Before we start the event, we're going to have the institutional video about the second census of the judiciary power. Have you answered the second census of the judiciary power? In the second edition, we're going to have get to know the servers, the judges that work in the Brazilian justice. Also knowing the socioeconomic profile, the census is going to allow us to understand the level of satisfaction in your work environment and what are the impacts of this routine in your personal life, health, and well being. And with these answers, CNJ will be able to develop public policies to strengthen the judiciary and to improve the public services. And it's very short, it doesn't take more than 10 minutes to answer it. Participate in it, and it happens every 10 years. I have already done my part. I have already done my part. I have already done my part. Do your part as well. We thank everyone that is here with us in this event to share the institutional video that was produced by the program Fazendo Justiça that was done to the monitoring of people. There was also a video about the society in general. It's a campaign for us to understand the role of the electronic monitoring. The videos are available in CNJ and in YouTube channel. We would like for you to participate and be part of it in our social media. And we come back to our electronic monitoring international conference. And for those who participate in person, the registration of frequency is going to be done by the QR code and is going to be made available in the beginning and in the entrance of the auditorium. The attendees should sign their names in the beginning, and now we're going to have the role of the new technologies in support to the electronic monitoring with the mediator of the public defender of Ceará and the incarceration system and social economic measurement, Leandra Lisboa, and the judge of Santa Catarina, Alexandre Moraes da Rosa, the professor of the University of Bucharest in Romania, Ion Dunescu, and the professor senior of criminology in the University of Stirling, Hannah Graham. And now we pass the floor to Liana. Good morning, everyone. To have more accessibility, I'm going to briefly do a self-description. I am a white woman with black curly hair. I use glasses with a black dress and a green coat, and I am in the center of the table, the opening table. For us to start this conference today, I would like to greet everyone that is here in our table. Ian Durnesco, Alexandre Moraes da Rosa, and Hannah Graham. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone who is here present with us, and the ones that are following us in the YouTube channel of CNJ. It is with a lot of honor that I open the first panel of the second day of the International Conference of Electronic Monitoring Technology, Ethics, and Guarantee of Rights. It's the role of the new technologies and the support of the electronic monitoring. This morning, we're going to have the privilege to hear international panelists as Dr. Ion Donesco from Romania and Hannah Graham from United Kingdom. And we're going to have the honor to hear from Alexandre Moraes da Rosa, who is a Brazilian judge sharing his experience about this topic. There's still a lot of challenge regarding the electronic monitoring to become a policy of substitution to the uh, not only an expansion of the penal control, and within this we have many equipments that occupy the central role in the electronic monitoring, and there is a problem in fulfilling the measurements and the failures of these equipment. Many times these incidents have physical damage to the person that is being monitored, and this harms not only the person to fulfill this surveillance, but also in the trust to the actors of justice, the members of the courts, and making the measure more effective. So we need to ask ourselves, how can the new technologies favor the improvement of the electronic monitoring devices? There are experiences and tests that were already consolidated in other countries that can contribute to our debate in Brazil. And Brazil being a country with deep historical social inequalities, how can they equate these potentialities presented by the new technologies and the digital fracture? Those are a few provocations that I leave to you initially for our debate. And without any further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Ion Dornescu, who is going to be presented formally now. Dr. Ion Dornescu is a professor of the University of Bucharest in Romania and in fields of de-risk, radicalization, and free parole and the justice system, re-entrance of the penal courts. He is one of the editors of Probation Europe and author of Core Correctional Skills that were also translated to Portuguese, and also a conductor of the European Journal of Probation. And you have 25 minutes to your presentation.
I think I will come over here. Can you, let's see if it works. Can you hear me? Yes. All good? Excellent. Bom dia a todos. It's great to be here. It's a great honor. I decided to stand up and present like that because I'm still impacted by jet lag, so to make sure that I will not fall asleep, I thought it's best to stand up and make sure that if I fall asleep, I will immediately wake up and come back. It's great to be here, as I said. It's a fantastic opportunity to be here. I think I need a clicker.
This?
Yes. Excellent. Yeah, the idea is that although I came only yesterday, I feel like I belong to the place in many ways. I think I can understand the language already quite well. I saw that we have a lot of similarities between the Romanian language and the Portuguese language. For example, I can tell you a full sentence in Portuguese, but is actually Romanian, or the other way around. So, here we go. Com quilo de carne e com litro de vinho, não se morre de fome or de sete. Did you understand me? You see? That's Romanian. Having said that, now I would like to move on to the presentation, talking about the role of the new technologies in supporting electronic monitoring. The structure of the presentation is quite straightforward. At the beginning, I will remind you about a short history about electronic monitoring, where we are today. And then we will discuss a little bit about the advantages, about the disadvantages or the risks of electronic monitoring. And at the end, we're going to discuss about the potential solutions, because that's why we are here, to try to overcome these kind of risks or to mitigate them. So looking at the history of electronic monitoring, we know that everything really started with a research project called Street Corner Research, which began in 1958. Dr. Svirzebel in 1963 developed a so-called behavioral electronics that was actually attached to the it had a transmitter that was attached to the belt of the person in order to monitor the behavior, the movements of the person. In 1983, Judge Jack Love in United States used this technology for the first time for a probationer who violated the terms and conditions. And then since then, electronic monitoring is developing very rapidly all around the world, not only for probationers who violate their conditions, but to all sorts of functions. For example, at the end of the 80s, England and Wales took over this technology. In Sweden was developed and adopted in 1994, Netherlands in 1995, and so on. Nowadays, probably 80% of the whole globe is covered with this kind of technologies one way or another. Today, you can, if you look at the use of electronic monitoring, you can find it as an alternative to pretrial detention, as an obligation attached to community sanctions and measures, as a form of pre-release or attached to pre-release, as an obligation for those who are on work release, as an obligation after full release, sanction for breaching the suspended sentence or probation, obligation for temporary release, obligation for domestic violence cases. Also, as you will hear about in Portugal and in other countries, you can see it as a bilateral electronic monitoring. Obligation for asylum seekers, as a wristband to track small children or elderly with dementia. You can find it in Saudi Arabia as used for wife tracking and so on. So as you can see, electronic monitoring developed quite extensively since 1980s when it was introduced for the first time. Well, there are some advantages for that, and probably disadvantages justify or fuel this kind of rapid development of electronic monitoring. As Mike Nellis said, it can be ascribed many different aims, and it can be easily be adapted and to different situations. So this kind of versatility actually makes it very easy to be expanded, developed vertically, horizontally, and so on. The main advantages that you can find in the literature attached to electronic monitoring are that it's more human than prison. So we have that kind of principle of lesser kind of evil. It's cheaper and easy deployable. It seems to be cheaper than imprisonment, but of course we will come back to this to see if it's really cheaper. It can be an alternative to prison or pretrial detention. It reduces impunity in some countries. You know, in some countries, if the prisons are overcrowded, they introduced waiting lists. So people can wait for 2, 3, 5 years sometimes before they start serving the prison sentence. Introducing electronic monitoring makes the application of the sanctions more faster, let's say. Or it can be also used for rehabilitation and reintegration under certain conditions. There are also there is some criticism attached to electronic monitoring. Again, if you look in the literature and the experiences from different global jurisdictions, you will find some criticism like this almost in every jurisdiction. It contributes to net widening. It seems that introducing electronic monitoring in many countries actually brought more people into the justice net than contributed really to an alternative to incarceration. And I think you here are quite familiar with the phenomenon. It has a lot of hidden costs, especially if electronic monitoring is not an alternative to pretrial or to incarceration, but it's an added cost to the incarceration or detention. Presents quite a lot of financial pressure for disadvantaged people. There are some countries where those subjected to electronic monitoring are required to pay for this service, so you can imagine how difficult it is for them to do so. Impact also on housemates, not only on the subjects themselves, not only of the sentenced people. And we discussed about that yesterday as well, when we discussed about the portable prison, virtual prisons, incarceration, and so on. It becomes more and more intrusive, unfortunately. It is degrading because, again, we have evidence from literature showing that people wearing these bracelets, even if they are discreet, small, whatever, they still send a very bad symbolic message to those who are wearing them. Ensures only short-term and instrumental compliance. And Antia probably will talk more about the difference between instrumental and substantive compliance, or short-term, long-term compliance. And we'll see that electronic monitoring is actually contributing to short-term objectives, to instrumental compliance rather than long-term substantive compliance that talks about rehabilitation and social reintegration. It can become a status symbol in some subcultures, and I've seen that happening in some African jurisdictions. Some people are really proud to have something like that to wear and to show that they are really tough and important in their own terms. Undermine the probation mission. And I think a lot of countries, unfortunately, can say about electronic monitoring that it does not help the probation development or the rehabilitation activity in those jurisdictions. It's unavailable for special groups still, for foreign offenders, for homeless people, for Roma people, and so on. And it contributes to the postmodern culture of surveillance. And we will continue to develop this in the next slides. Major risks attached to electronic monitoring currently around the world, and I think it's something that we need to reflect on those and see how we can mitigate them. And these risks are interrelated, and some of them are even unintentional. So again, speaks quite a lot about, what do we mean by justice and how do we use this justice apparatus in serving the society long-term aims. So the first major risk is mass surveillance or transcarceration, as you will find it in the literature, because it has an unlimited potential to grow. Electronic monitoring can grow forever. It can grow, and one day it might cover all of us if we are not careful. So this kind of dystopian development, it's something that we need to reflect in a very serious way. You can find electronic monitoring with new functions. You can find electronic monitoring now impacting new populations. We have debates in Europe about introducing electronic monitoring for juveniles and so on. So we have to be very careful how we expand this and to whom and for what. It's becoming cheaper and cheaper around the world, especially now when we are talking about replacing the bracelets with apps. We have more and more discussions about that. Apps with voice recognition or face recognition can easily replace the bracelets, following the same kind of security protocols and so on. So all we have to do is to install an app on any smartphone, and that tool can become an electronic monitoring device. Very cheaply, and very easy to use. So we have to be very careful with this development. We also talk about implant technologies. There are people talking about having a microchip implanted under the skin, subdermal. So you can also do it like that. Again, quite cheap, easy to use, very not visible, very discreet. So there are a lot of advantages, let's say, to this kind of developments. So we might forget about privacy for the sake of convenience. And I think we have to be very careful with this kind of arguments. It becomes quite normalized now, because if it becomes less and less visible, then it reduces the stigma and it can be easily accepted by everybody. But it can also exclude the human element and the substantive compliance. Creates a lot of synergies with other technologies, and I think this is something that we have to be very careful about, because using electronic monitoring together with transdermal alcohol detection or RAM system for measuring alcohol level in the blood, this kind of developments, although they might sound quite practical and effective, they can be quite dangerous in terms of intrusion, in terms of human rights, data protection, and so on. Again, another great risk, I think, for electronic monitoring is the so-called using electronic monitoring for preventive strategies. As you know, we use electronic monitoring nowadays just to observe what is happening or react retroactively to the wrongdoings. But now there are more and more people arguing that with the level of technologies, the technology that we have nowadays, we can even anticipate or even prevent some crimes to happen. Okay? So we have this kind of idea that we can install in the bracelets some kind of sensors, and then we can, in case somebody is about to commit a crime, we can see that from the blood pressure, from the quality of the sweat, and so on. And then we can send an electric shock that will incapacitate that person to act. So the so-called dirty technologies, in Mike Nelly's term, are quite dangerous, and we have to be very careful. Again, I can see a lot of politicians, I can see a lot of people from the grand public being, speaking in favor of this kind of developments, but we have to be very careful about the long-term effects of this kind of things. Careful with big data and AI integration. Again, we have people talking about, we have quite respected scholars actually talking about designing risk profiles, and then based on that to incapacitate people to commit crimes if the kind of risk assessment is telling us that they are about to commit such wrongdoings. We can really get into, probably you remember the book Minority Report with the pre-crime department. We can easily get there if we are not careful. The use of new and intrusive technologies, like for example the biometric monitoring. The other day I was reading about the progress, let's say, in the developments regarding the brain-computer interface. So we have more and more developments in this direction, and probably they can easily be linked with electronic monitoring and preventing crime strategies. This can be quite dangerous. And why? Because they can be very, very appealing to those who are very risk-aversive, or they are looking for easy votes to get for the next elections. Okay, so this takes us to the next topic, the next risk, that is the changes in the penal culture that electronic monitoring brought into the field. We are talking about, oh, that's an interesting, okay, it's back, good. We are talking more and more about the punishment for profit. We have more and more pro-profit companies involved in this field. We have commercial enterprises rather than NGOs or state agencies involved in implementing these technologies. And unfortunately, what we have seen in some countries, running for profit may lead to corruption or overcharging. Probably you all remember the scandal in England and Wales with G4S overcharging for dead people, or for people who were not actually on electronic monitoring anymore. So you can see a lot of accidents like this, so we have to be very careful. Corruption is also quite big, because we are talking about billions of dollars involved. According to some estimates, by the end of 2020s, it is possible that this market will reach to more than $1 billion US only in the United States. So you can imagine what can happen when you have such a budget in your hands. What sort of influence you can buy with it. So very careful with the corruption, very careful with lobby and political influence. Again, a very big risk associated to that is the data mishandling. Personal data can be used as a commercial good. We hear already, we even have movies about how data can be sold and used in different fields. And again, we have to be very careful with this. Again, electronic monitoring related to other developments in the digital era we are all living in, can also lead to changes in the urban cultures. For example, the connecting electronic monitoring with CCTV recordings, with the so-called criminogenic zones that the concept used in the police, the concept of smart city, social credit, and so on. They can really create some kind of culture of malopticum, as it was called by Fergus McNeill. So we have to be very careful how to assess these developments, how to look at how these developments interrelate with each other, and make sure that we have protections in place to prevent this kind of bad developments to happen. As you can see, all these developments are quite appealing for some governments, especially if you look around the world. We see quite a worrying rise in populism and in polarization and in radicalization and so on. So in this kind of political context, this kind of developments can be seen or can be sold as solutions, and probably we will not be able to fight against them if we are not prepared. Some possible solutions for a responsible use of electronic monitoring in criminal justice. First of all, we should have strong regulations and monitoring bodies. In Europe, we have the Council of Europe recommendation of 2014 on electronic monitoring. Those who are working on developing the regulations in this field, I strongly recommend you to have a look at it, because it can give you some good ideas about how electronic monitoring can be used in a kind of responsible way. We have to have regular reviews and updates, including at ethical and legal aspects, not only in terms of effectiveness or in terms of the technology itself. We need to use these technologies with parsimony and only as an alternative to detention if possible. So there are some ways that we can use electronic monitoring really to become an alternative to detention. We have seen some examples in Canada and in Finland where this happened. Of course, electronic monitoring itself or alone cannot do the trick, but electronic monitoring together with other measures like training, changing the regulations regarding pretrial detention and so on can really contribute to decarceration. So do not look at electronic monitoring as an easy solution, but take it in combination with other measures to really achieve the objectives that you have in mind. Maintain the human touch, if possible, for the long-term reintegration purposes. Again, electronic monitoring in itself is just a monitoring tool that will not really lead to any behavioral change unless it's coupled with something else, with some transformative interventions. And we have some countries, for example, in Denmark, even the technical team, the technical team that is going to install the equipment is trained in electronic monitoring. And this is the reason I brought you today as a present my last book, Core Correctional Skills, a training kit, where you can find all these 5 key skills that we need to use in order to support rehabilitation and assistance. How to build up the working alliance, how to do pro-social modeling, problem solving, motivation interviewing, and cognitive interventions. You can find all this information here, and I'm ready to donate this book to anybody who is interested in developing the rehabilitation services in Brazil. Moreover, pay attention to ethical and human rights implications. We have to be very careful because some of these developments are sold as very convenient, very easy to do, very cheap. And due to this kind of attractiveness, we might fall into different traps. So again, very careful consideration of ethical and human rights. Adopt secure data practices, encryptions, limitations in access, and so on. Again, data is very, very important. Data is becoming more and more expensive and more important for the commercial purposes, and therefore it can be easily manipulated. So we have to be very careful and have strong protocols for data protection. Promote new forms of capitalism where profit is not the only legitimate outcome that a company, private company should have, but this is more like a societal, philosophical aim. It's not always in our hands, but it's good to reflect on that if possible. Here is a reference list if you want to read more about these issues. I hope you like this presentation and you find it useful. Thank you very much.
Doutor Johan, eu agradeço muito por sua fala e pelo estrito respeito ao tempo estabelecido.
That was allotted. Sir, it was a very important talk to the deepening of our dialogue this morning. And to continue the panel, I would like to invite to the panel Ms. Hannah Grant. Hannah is a senior professor of criminology and associate director of Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research of the University of Stirling, United Kingdom. She is also the member of the Council of Sentence, which is a consultative center. As a criminologist in Europe and Australia, she has dedicated to technology of electronic monitoring, rehabilitation, comparative research, policy of justice, and penology. She is also the author and editor of 4 books, including Innovation Justice and
Rehabilitative work in criminal justice.
she also was part of an European project of comparative research about the use of electronic monitoring as a possibility to prison in the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Holland. Dr. Hannah, you have 25 minutes for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. There should be a PowerPoint, hopefully. I wanted to start by saying thank you so much
Agradecendo muito a Isabela e a
team of formidable women, which many of you have probably met, but as international guests, we have just met them and we have enjoyed how kind and helpful they are, but also, importantly, the conversations about what is happening in your nation. So we are enjoying hearing and learning about what is happening here. Also, thank you to our hardworking interpreters and translators. Yes, you are going to have to thank yourself. And to our colleagues for joining us and offering remarks and provocations alongside what we are able to offer. I'm very glad that Johan has gone before me because then I can build on it. I don't intend to talk extensively about technology itself. Many conferences can be preoccupied with the what. What is the technology? What does it do? I am a criminologist who's worked in Australia and Scotland and across different European contexts, who is really interested in the environment or the practices, the realities in which we put that technology into. Because the best intentions in the world will not be able to explain what actually happens in practice. I don't know how badly this is going to translate, but in English we have a phrase saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think that applies well in criminology, but particularly where technology is used, you can have the best of intentions. You can want reform or change, but if we are not critical analytical, we could do harm, and harm often occurs in this area. This might be ironic, but I decided to work with artificial intelligence using a chatbot to chat about my presentation, and it created the images using a watercolour style. Fascinatingly, the AI chatbot refused to do certain images. So in its refusals, I asked it to create an image portraying the judiciary, and it said no. I asked it to create an image portraying police, and it said no. It said there are strong ethical, controversial sensitivities, and we need to have respect for human rights and diverse representations. When I asked the AI chatbot to represent people experiencing poverty and trauma and injustice, it didn't say no. So you will get to see some of those photos, or images, but you will also get to see a lot of pretty watercolours because I like art. I will be brief in my comments, hopefully, but based on the invitation and what I was encouraged to consider, the areas that I will look at, building on what Johan has said, he's laid the foundations very well, further questions around ethical challenges and considerations, and the question of can electronic monitoring and other technologies in criminal justice support rehabilitation and desistance from crime. So that is something that I look at in my research and my my writing and publications, and also probation and community justice. We need to unsettle our assumptions about the relationship between technology and justice. And I think we have already heard some remarks from colleagues here that are very aware of it. The opening addresses were excellent yesterday in acknowledging that sometimes things are faulty, sometimes there are harms, sometimes it is associated with injustice, not justice. So from a time of looking over the years at innovation and justice, when someone says that something is innovative, perhaps it is the criminologist in me, but I often don't believe them. And I want to ask, how is it innovative? Why is it innovative? For whom is it innovative? So questions that I have put these to the Europeans, I don't know how many times. Pedro and other colleagues have heard me raise these questions in Brussels and in Zagreb, in Croatia, and across Europe. They're very simple, so forgive me if they are a bit simple, but they are important to acknowledge at the outset. Just because the tech can do it doesn't mean that we should. Just because it's not prison doesn't mean that it is good or that it's ethical or that it's effective. Just because it is innovative doesn't mean that it is good. So I've actually co-authored a chapter with a colleague where we looked at innovative uses of technology. Some of them were in prisons. I thought that they might get in trouble with the Convention on Torture because they were humanising solitary confinement in very serious ways. But if we add some nice pictures of green plants on the wall of your solitary confinement for years and use technology that somehow makes it better, I will come back to that in a moment. If it is innovative according to who benefits. So I go to technology and justice conferences and there are certain tech specialists and there are often police there and they get very excited about the technologies. So it might be innovative to them, but is it innovative according to the person who is being tagged and monitored? Is it innovative according to their families and neighbours, their local communities? Is it innovative according to social workers or psychologists who might be supporting people? The answers are that it's not usually innovative to everyone because there are conflicting interests and tensions in rights in this area. Just because some say electronic monitoring helps rehabilitation doesn't mean that it does. I would like to problematise that assumption. You will already know this, and there's a much longer list than I can include here, but principles and values, purposes and functions matter, and they are not mutually exclusive, but also some of them can frustrate and be hypocritical or counterintuitive to some of the others. So if you put public protection, criminal investigation and surveillance in punitive ways much higher than supporting the monitored person, you might actually increase crime rates potentially. There are complex influences on what influences reoffending, but you can't put proportionality and fairness up here and then say let's have some very punitive and harmful uses, because quickly it will be disproportionate. So you already know this. I won't dwell long on this. My Belgian colleague Tom Dayens has written an amazing book on electronic monitoring, and it's very critical around the culture of surveillance in how we monitor offenders. And he talks about how alternatives can become additives. Jon Donescu, Fergus McNeil, Ruben Jonathan Miller, a few Brazilian scholars have written excellently around how mass incarceration, mass supervision or mass control, and mass surveillance can interact with one another. It's not because one goes down it will somehow help with the other. It's rarely the case. So we can actually compound more problems for ourselves. There can be pains and harms, unintended consequences, but also Del Santo recognises some of the gains and says not everything is 100% dystopian and bad, in recognising that certain protections have perhaps helped alleviate suffering or advance human rights of people subject to monitoring or subject to imprisonment in Brazil and elsewhere. So we have to be nuanced in our analyses, but we can't say it's an alternative without accepting it will probably become, instead of either or, it will become both and, is more realistic. Again, I won't dwell on this for long, as Johan has mentioned it, but if you're planning on using more technology in Brazil or other nations, we have to think about this in Europe. Prepare a lot for a scandal that will upset the public, it will upset the politicians, it will upset the workers who don't necessarily want their work identity to be associated with a high-profile sensitive case. And sometimes that's not just an individual tagged person who goes on to, in Scotland we've had murders, not many, but we have had that. In Netherlands, England and Wales, Scotland, in other areas of our justice systems in Australia, we've seen fairly substantive scandals resulting in costly damages, fines, serious fraud investigations, a lot of harm, a lack of public trust and legitimacy, which matters to the interests of justice, because of failure, and let's be blunt, because of unethical uses. Even though the nice language would have been in the paperwork, the Dutch government and the Prime Minister resigned due to a scandal of an algorithm accusing people of fraud. So it is very serious. If it ruins marriages, if it affects child protection, if people lose their home or their job, if people take their own lives, or in Scotland, if over 1,000 people had their risk assessment wrong because the digital tool had a mistake and they were sentenced and granted parole or not granted parole based on a false score because the IT was faulty, these are very serious issues of access to justice, of human rights, and we have to approach them with our eyes wide open. To perhaps press the problematisation or the provocation even further, is technology, electronic monitoring technology, artificial intelligence technology, other digital support tools and apps, are these technologies in criminal justice a kind of decorative justice? So this is a concept by Leonidas Cheliotis. He doesn't write about technology, but he writes about the types of things that can look good, sound good, look new. A minister or a boss has something new to announce that they are doing, a press release perhaps, a social media statement, but actually it might have some qualities to it that is good, but what is it decorating? And if it's decorating or being ornamental, if it's distracting or obscuring away from serious harms and issues of human rights, then is it just? Is the technology being used to decorate from systemic failings? And I want to agree with and honour what the President of the Supreme Court and the National Council of Justice, Rosa Weber, said yesterday, using the remarks, warning us against the realities of stigma, structural violence and institutional violence. We have to have very honest, uncomfortable conversations about these as a reality, because punitive uses of technology and punitive uses of data about the person's life, about their body, about their daily routines, used en masse or individually, can be criminogenic, crime generating, harm generating, and it can form institutional violence and social control. My hope is that most people, or all people in this room, would not want their reputation associated with doing that level of harm. We have an ethical imperative to be careful not to decorate our justice system with new technology, new innovations that actually undermine a more humane, minimalist or proportionate response. My dear friend and colleague, Mike Nellis, who lives in Glasgow near me, and I ask him questions regularly over coffee. He is an international expert on electronic monitoring, but he also had been advising the Council of Europe around artificial intelligence and how it is starting to come alongside EM with prisons and probation and community-based justice systems. He stopped that role, but not before he wrote an excellent paper and a few presentations. This list is something that he talks about. It's from the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights. This list is originally only for artificial intelligence, but there are quite a few points on it that are very practical as to where we need to be thinking in our respective nations. Have we gone far enough? Do we have data protection and privacy on paper, but not in practice? Do we have independent oversight, but it is what, again, this is probably terrible, but in English we call it a toothless tiger, a tiger that has no power to do anything. So is independent oversight powerful enough? Does it have the authority that when private companies and when public sector organisations breach people's human rights, that it is not just, oh well, we will improve. The word improvement is always used, particularly in place of apology. Does the independent oversight actually have the authority and the power to work with the justice system and to terminate private contracts or to fine them tens or hundreds of millions if that needs to go through the courts? It's amazing how much that can motivate people, the idea of not losing masses of profit. There's important things around non-discrimination and equality, designing in fairness. My colleagues Anthea and also James and Emmett will have some amazing things to tell you about equality, anti-racism and non-discrimination, so I will not dwell long on that, but it is a real passion. In electronic monitoring, one size does not fit all. And protecting the freedoms, what happens to the right to work? What happens to freedom of expression? What happens to freedom of association? And these are not necessarily, or should not be, automatically removed simply because you use drugs, or simply because you've been caught up in justice, or simply because you're very unwell psychologically and you need help. How do we protect those freedoms while still having risk management and safeguards? Before I move on, the other point I want to emphasise is that the Commissioner for Human Rights says that there must be remedies for harm done to people by AI decision making. Do we have remedies for harm done to people by electronic monitoring? And are those remedies meaningful? We don't want to be planning for everything to go wrong and then we'll just give them a little bit of compensation. But an observation of someone's human dignity and personhood is that if things have gone wrong, will there be an official apology? Will there be recompense or remedy? You can't claim to be a progressive justice system and a democracy if there's no remedies for people that have been harmed by what you have authorised and done. This is in Portuguese. I cannot speak or read Portuguese, so I will get the English version. Before I finish, I want to move to desistance and rehabilitation, because that was the other question that I was asked. I wrote a book chapter with my colleague Fergus McNeill, and it was in a book of criminologists that were translated. We published it in English, and then we were all translated by amazing colleagues into Portuguese. So I will read this in English. Some of what is done in the name of justice may be criminogenic rather than constructive. We know, for example, that in many jurisdictions, incarceration in general tends to increase the risks of future crime and criminalisation. The influence of some forms of probation supervision with regards to desistance may be more positive, but that influence appears to remain modest in most cases. It's unsurprising, therefore, that desistance scholars, which Fergus and I, that's what we research, among other things, have regularly called for the reconfiguration of criminal justice, arguing strongly that systems-level change and structural change and cultural social change is needed to better support desistance and social reintegration. We use the form reintegration as a way of acknowledging that not all of those that criminal justice may seek to reintegrate have ever been meaningfully integrated in the first place. So that's a recognition of inequalities and injustices. This is not to say that desistance processes cannot begin and be supported in prison or during community supervision, but it is to recognise the need to unsettle any established assumptions, especially among criminal justice professionals and policymakers, that punishment can somehow produce positive change. In nearly all cases, officially or unofficially, electronic monitoring is punishment. So we need to be quite clear that, not 100%, but we need to be clear that it may not produce what we hope for or what is good. So why talk about desistance and rehabilitation? Well, actually, the key ingredients that desistance and rehabilitation are supported by sometimes have nothing to do with the justice system. Relationships, changing your narrative and your identity, being able to access work, volunteering or meaningful sources of income, being able to support and give back to other people. Desistance and rehabilitation are processes of human development that belong to the people themselves who are going through them. They are not the property of psychologists or justice ministers or anyone else. So we need to foreground the lived experience and the views of those going through the process. And a provocation based on different understandings of rehabilitation is, do uses of electronic monitoring and other newer technologies help, hinder, or harm rehabilitation and desistance processes? The reality is it can sometimes be all of the above in different ways. And when we use the term rehabilitation or desistance in English, there's often a very narrow, almost neoliberal, individualistic, responsibilising way of only seeing it as personal rehabilitation. That individual case has broken the law, they have been sentenced, they have done wrong, they must pay back to their community, they must be punished, and they must change. I sit on a sentencing council. I work with the judiciary and I advise judiciary policymakers, justice professionals and so on. I understand that personal rehabilitation frame. It is one of the principles or the purposes of sentencing. But there's other forms of rehabilitation that we must not lose sight of. And this is, again, my colleague Fergus McNeill's typology. How can we claim to be doing personal rehabilitation and using tagging technologies and apps and other technologies to help people leave crime behind and to rehabilitate themselves if we also have major institutional, social, structural obstacles to their social rehabilitation? So some of your literature here talks about reinsertion, re-socialisation, reintegration. These are terms that we also use in Europe in different languages. It is hypocritical of us to say, why aren't you doing better when the conditions around them look like an absolute war zone. Like there's not even electricity, or there's not fundamental human rights, there's not a safe home, there's not safe and respectful relationships. So we have to be very careful that if people can never leave their past behind, so if they, with legal rehabilitation and moral rehabilitation, if there is no ways of recognising that they have changed and that they are leaving crime behind, how can we say to them, you're not doing well enough, but we will never see you as anything other than criminal. You will wear this stigma forevermore. Again, I point to your colleagues' insightful remarks about institutional violence and structural violence. What do we want to be a part of? These forms of rehabilitation can be well supported, and that's why we write endless books about them, and that's why it is a celebration in our career. But we have to listen to the people who are going through the processes themselves. In terms of listening to people, our colleague has recommended that you have a book on experiences of electronic monitoring here in Brazil called Short Circuit. And also I brought up one of the footnotes to say that there has been research on the lived experiences and perspectives of people who've been electronically monitored in Brazil. I don't have expertise in that area, so I will point to them. But in Scotland, England and Wales, across Europe, in Australia, and so on, we are regularly pointing to good research that listens to the people that have been through the process, because we will quickly see the gap between what we have on paper and what we have in reality. I also do a lot of research with practitioners, so interviewing and observing, spending time around people who work in this area, and they will tell you extensively about the gaps in realities. So these are things we want to bring up. I don't have time to focus on this, and that is fine. I want to prioritise being critical and provocative rather than endlessly positive, because we have to be careful. I don't want to decorate certain things. But I have written separately with a colleague, Jason Morris, a book on a book chapter on how can uses of technology be more rehabilitation and assistance oriented. Again, it has to be anchored in listening to lived experience and harnessing peer support. And the data has to be protected and not accessed by, for example, police and so on. It has to be for purposes of change. So, we have different paths we could be heading down. We could be envisioning better futures together that are more around well-being, community orientation, safer societies. We can also be predicting punitive futures. Johan has spoken to how that could happen, and this AI paper has some very scary dystopian examples in how it might interact with EM in prisons and probation. I think realistically the future will involve both, but I can orient towards an impulse for hope that the more that we focus on ethics and guaranteeing or enforcing human rights, we might be able to at least try and reduce some of the harms and be more honest about the harms associated with electronic monitoring and associated technologies. There's lots of references. I don't expect you to read those, but I'm an academic. So thank you very much for your time and for listening. And I hope that that has been helpful or challenging towards the conversations that you are having locally. And we look forward to hearing more about your insights here. So I will pass over to my colleague. Thank you.
Ana, muito obrigada.
Miss Hannah, thank you so much for sharing with us your experience, your provocations, and so necessary for our debate today. So, without any further ado, continuing our work here, Alexandre Moraes da Rosa is going to continue with his contributions. He's a judge of justice in Santa Catarina's court and postdoc in UNB. He has a PhD in the University of Paraná with a stage of post degree in the Coimbra University. So he's a Master of Law in the University of Santa Catarina and of UFFC, and he is a part of the program of PhD of Univali. He is a judge of justice in the Santa Catarina state and a part of the Ibero-American law and artificial intelligence research. He researches big data and geometry and artificial intelligence applied to the judiciary courts in a transdisciplinary manner, and Spino Lab, CNPq, and the Alexandre Valley. You have 25 minutes, and I would like to thank everyone and the psychological restriction and the capacity to move in any way that invades his integrity and privacy. That is the description of the Penal Code Article 147 and the execution of the Penal Code. We search for the people, and we will, in this space that was searched by Liana in this area and Lamfred. Thank you so much for the invitation and participating in this conference. And thank you so much, Mr. Ian and Ms. Hannah. The future is here, and now we have a policy in the electronic monitoring from a very absolute point of view. We spend a lot of fortunes in mechanisms that don't make any sense for being used. And there is the stigmatization that we also have seen in all of the fields regarding that. We have heard today that in 2023 and almost in 2024, situations such as this, we have cases that we have an analogical uncertainty. We go to our houses and the defensory office and some judges as well have also been in this area. We have this feeling of safety, but the quantity of devices and a device like this is used is very scary. We don't have the dimension of that because we have a sensation, a feeling, and a technological discussion in the analogical point of view. And the great leap that we have today is recognizing the importance of the limitations of the invasion. And I'm a little bit older, and as a substitute judge, Marcelo Carinho is away, and many people from Santa Catarina is watching us. This is an older movie about Krishna. I am older, but in this term of the future, the exterminator, it seemed that we could see a sender with our eyeglasses. But now it's not away from our reality. We can all have a profile understood and read and tracked. I work with technologies and I have worked with Pegasus. It can enter the cell phone from anyone without having to have a link. I can click on it, and there are several devices in the world, several apps that you can hire, even in Brazil, to be able to find people and invade cell phones. It is something that is recurring from our time. Hannah has talked about that, the sensors that can be installed at different areas in different perspectives. Jeff Bezos was hacked. So do you think that you are safe? So it's bizarre that people think that they are safe. And there's a friend of mine that wanted to sell her cell phone, and I said, did you re-raise your photos? And I said, no, you haven't, because there is a hash, a 00 that is put there. Oh, so I was going to sell my phone with all of my phone with all of my pictures, and then there are pictures that are leaked from you, and you don't know even know why. So we need a digital literacy, and we're not only talking about ourselves. There are people like Alessandro that have a broad experience in this area, but there is a great disparity in this area. There are people that understand everything, and there are people that don't know what hash is, and they are being hacked everywhere in the world. So it's important for us to have this context. I did this contextualization just to show you this impact. Someone, for example, avoids someone from entering the prison. How many of us know that a great part of the prison is not dominated by the state? They are dominated by factions, and there is a soldier that is put there, and we ask, what is your side, from the bad side or the good side? And you are recruiting people at each moment that you are there that is going to work inside the prison. And I have several testimony of people that leave the prison, but they continue paying their friends, or else they are not protected inside the prison. So the idea of the prisons, the way that we have them today, arose from a place and a moment that don't make sense anymore. But this means what Hannah has said and Jan said of a populism. All of us want safeness, but sometimes we don't feel so safe, and sometimes it's difficult to be shown. And what I want to show you is that there is a important point that is always mentioned. I know that technology is not neutral. Technology comes to invade our day-to-day lives and serves for many purposes. I would like to show you, like our professor has said, the reduction of damages. How can I use technology on the contrary, in the other way around? How can I use technology to reduce damages? And there is the idea of looking for a competitive advantage. The man went to the moon in 69. There are people that are negating that, saying that this didn't take place. But there is a person that was in this court, and it was really small with that writing machine, and this was the remote control. And how are we in 2023? With computers, with big cell phones, small cell phones, we have them in our daily lives. And how is the court now? There's a computer that we use as if it was a typewriter in the past, but it doesn't have the potential. We don't see the potential behind that. This definitely repercutes with in some alterations of the way that we deal with things nowadays in the courts, which is the use of the machines, of the mathematical armament in mass persecution. I was threatened one day. I use an app called Live 360 that shows me what I have. And I have other apps from Brazil as well, that I cannot say that in Brazil this happens, but in Lithuania, for example, I can say that. In Lithuania, there is an app that you can look for people. In Brazil, for example, we have several apps that we can track people. So the police officers, they can say, give me your cell phone, give me your cell phone, give me your password. And they put a tracker, they put an app like this to look for the person. So they give back to the person, and they say, give it back, and they do imprisonments because they can access that remotely. And in my class in Univale, where I give classes in the master and PhD classes, that we have a subject just for that. Can we invade people's office? Can we do a hacking in people Can we stalk people? We harass people, persecute people? And people say no, no, we can't. But we can. We take 10 minutes and we invade everything that people have done in there. We are a little bit prehistorical in the execution of the trials, but we need to be able to deal with this in the penal execution and the imprisonment. And what we need today to know, at least, is what each one of these people mean. People confuse internet with the web. They don't know the difference between what is the physical app and what is the civil mark of the internet. Sometimes we talk about that to the judges and they don't know anything about that. They don't know what LGBT is. And we live in a state of exception of data, and the whole world is worried about data, but we have a rule of LGBT that excludes that. And we have amendments in the Constitution that are fundamental rights, and the police officer cannot take pictures in WhatsApp and send that to the victim. So that is a lack of compliance. So what I want to show you some facts and some experiences that we have. We have a situation here that is really interesting about the use of virtual assistants like Alexa, Google. They talk to one another sometimes. It's interesting. I put Alexa and Google to talk to one another, and they think that they are speaking to each other. It's funny, and they talk for a long, long time, and one speaks, the other one speaks, and it was a wonderful experience. And we also have G- GPT, ChatGPT, and OpenAI, and I put my books in ChatGPT for in Microsoft, and I could produce text from. And we can also do trials online. We can do sentences, and in the sense, what we have today, it's a famous case from Victor Collins, and I forgot his last name, but they rescued the conversations or the recordings of Alexa in the previous day. And I'm just saying all of this just to reach a point, which is a protection point of thing. So, for example, what is OPCAN? It was the acquiring of cookies. For example, those are many apps that can discover what you do. They trace your profile. So, for example, I can see here every time that we go to the supermarket and we put our ID or our taxpayer's ID to know what we're going to buy. We don't worry a lot about that. After all, everyone gives their data, but that is what our big challenge is. In the United States, there was an interesting story because we can look for people's data through their history. And one of the investigations that is done today is what we have researched in our history in our computer. And this is something important. And what I would like to show you is the possibility, for example, there was a woman that was being beaten by her husband, and Alexa called the police because when we accepted the terms and conditions, it was there. If there is a crime that is practiced and we know about that, we need to report that. So it's reported that, and technology was made for that. Yes, there is a possibility of using that in the penal execution. Yes. What I would like to show you also what we have today, we all have a profile. During the pandemic, we had 95% of the people in the COVID-19 pandemic at home. So it's impossible for someone not to have a Gmail. We do a registration in the cell phone, and the structure is thought of this way. So there is a Gmail, there is a cell phone, and this means that Google knows in what cell phone I am, and they can track you. But people were not leaving home. They didn't know who this person was, but they knew that this cell phone did not leave their home at that moment, and there was a probability of them attributing this perspective. I have a problem in my eye, and I cannot see the slides right now, but let's see. I have cataract. But at that time, the this was a huge debate. But now in this new debate of different apps that can be made, there are different mechanisms that we need to think about. There is a medical discussion of the use of the of body chip. HANA has that in England, several startups that work with that. There is a payment that can be done with the cell phone, and there can be done with the hand, with the chip. There are technologies that are sold that make people's lives easier in between quotes, but in a way they are monitoring people, and we need to understand this deeply. Data, they are registrations of the reality, and information is the data with a sense attributed to it, and knowledge is what we build through this data and this information and this knowledge. And before, the data was what was important. Now, what is important is the metadata, the data on the data. And a few days ago, I was with the judge and a lawyer, and they sent an email, and the email was not received by us. So I said, What is your email?" "Oh, it's Gmail." "So give me the metadata of your email, so I'm going to see where this email reached in some place." And I have deleted the email, and I said, uh, so they have no idea how to deal with this knowledge. And I know that to send an email, there is a protocol. The internet was thought of this way with different protocols, and you can look for that with the three little dots that are in the right tab. And you can look for this. What are the metadata? The metadata are the data related to, for example, the protocols that you used, the machine that you used, how many people used it. I have an Instagram, Alexandre Moraes da Rosa, and I know that who goes to my Instagram, they do not follow me, and I know exactly who are there, who go there. It's funny, there's a guy that goes there every day, and people who think that it's okay to go in my Instagram, but I have some apps that track people that go in my Instagram. So when I go to Instagram and Facebook, and I can like or dislike what the person do, and sometimes people do a fake link, and I can look for the person through her IP and OSINT, and you can find anyone through this app. There are different apps in Brazil, OSINT, and some other ones that are prohibited, but you can find like Social Link and some other that are data banks that are very interesting. But why is that? In this perspective, the way that we are using technologies, we have sensors that can avoid someone's imprisonment. And nowadays, we can pay for not going to the prison, and we can pay a bail, for example. And there is a monitoring that can avoid a person from entering the system. Can't I have a mechanism that is more sophisticated to face this issue and not only have one way of going to prison or not going to prison? We have some surveillance of data that are very interesting today, which is called data violence, which is the step ahead of the monitoring through cameras that we have nowadays, which is face recognition, the discussions regarding the prejudice that exists behind that. I'm not going to talk about prejudice, but although I have been researching about that, I would just like to talk about the fact that we have difficulties to do interracial recognition. This is not exactly a prejudice, but if you insert a child, for example, of only watching one soccer team, for example, game, when the indigenous people were here, they didn't know what the ship was, and the response was interesting. What did he do? We don't have an understanding what this means in the management of the prisons and the s- standardization, the possibility with the use of mechanisms and technological perspectives. I put a picture of mine here because I'm a judge who works in a forum with big data, and we have a computer which is a power text and technology. CNJ, there are different interesting judges and different managements. What we know today is that the judiciary doesn't want technology, and I'm not judging that. I'm just saying that to make our lives easier, we can judge simple things. And why can't we say that there are sentences that need inference because the machine doesn't do inference? They can do inferences from standards, but the machine does calculates things and it's mathematical. And the idea of building hypotheses with a lot of sophistication. Nowadays, there are interesting programs of technology to use. I know that I'm almost with my time up, but I'm going to make an invitation to you. We need to understand the bias of the curto afundado. When a ship sinks, to remove that ship from the bottom of the ocean is much more expensive than buying a new one. We have an understanding that it's not worth changing one car to another. We have already invested so much. That is a cognitive error of thinking. It's a bias. And the great leap is maybe we need to implement an analogical things with digital things. And what makes me upset is that I have apps that the person can present in the forum. I have facial recognition, GPS, digital recognition, and I can use favorable things to the person. For example, instead of the person signing in person, she can do it online instead of leaving her work and having to come to the forum. So we can use technology for the reduction of damages and see where we have the possibility of helping the person. Of course, that I have a significant use of that, but when we use technology in this perspective, I am an autist, okay? I don't have I have level 1 autism. I was a weird type of teenager, but I discovered that now, autists don't recognize that we live in our own world and we don't care about that the rest of the world. But we have a very logical way of thinking. And in this movie here that was recorded regarding Bob, Bob was a great mathematician. He is playing chess, and the way he plays removes the rational understanding of the winner of chess, who was Russian. When he changes the strategy, this is where this changes. The populism works in a very weird way. We have a perspective nowadays. For example, monitoring, we need to use monitoring because of terrorism and because of different attacks. I need to know where this data are and who controls those data. I don't have any management of that data nowadays, and I don't have any control, any democratic control in the way that we accomplish things. In the private field, just for us to finish, I have been reading some very interesting works regarding judges and the imprisonment. Last but not least, there is this interesting book that was translated into Portuguese about mathematical machines that are used for mass destruction, and the dangers were already said by Ian. We can put sensors to identify alcohol in the blood. I can see where the person is looking to send shocks to the person. This is thought of in some initiatives to sexual harassments or the sexual sex offenders. There are different discussions regarding that. So this makes us think about the possibilities of our reality in a context that is not analogical anymore. It's digital now. And who wins? This is an interesting question with the electronic monitoring. Eric Vacan says, who wins with that? I have suggested many times. Put a panel there. How much does this prisoner costs for us? How much does it cost to maintain a prisoner? For example, I have judged a traffic dealer, only one, for all of these 25 years. The rest are Uber, the people who risks themselves. And now I reach my final point. There is processing, and what I would like to show you, what is a judge fearful of? A moral risk. Moral risk is not a concept of the law. It's what, for example, the profile of the insurance company does. When the judge receives, for example, a sex offender there, and there's something related to the freedom, who is going to be held as a victim is going to be him. So if we create a mechanism of reduction of the risk of the judge, it's the best situation that we can have, and technology in the sense can help us, because the judge from Argentina that was sent away, he had several rapes, and he raped another person, and he was put retired. So we have the moral risk, and technology can mitigate and have more indicators. According to the American Supreme Court, we have perverse actions regarding that. I'm so sorry to have gone a little bit over my time.
Thank you, Alexandre. It's always a pleasure to hear you. This theme is very provocative, very rich in debates, and we could spend hours here with provocations, questions, reflections, but unfortunately, we don't have the time, and we still have other panels to be presented. So I close this panel and we'll get the floor back to the MC. We thank the speakers, and now we are going to see the institutional video produced by Doing Justice on the EM of People.
Nada disso. Uma pessoa só está circulando na rua usando esse dispositivo porque passou por um processo cuidadoso de análise do seu caso. E o juiz ou a juíza entenderam que ela pode seguir a sua vida, ainda que com algumas restrições.
Ah, sim. Já vi gente usando nas redes sociais e revistas, jornais. Mas parece que fica uma ideia de impunidade, sabe? Que a pessoa não está pagando por nada que ela fez de errado.
Vamos por partes. Nem toda pessoa em monitoração eletrônica foi condenada judicialmente. Às vezes ainda está respondendo a processo, e muitas vezes o processo nem termina em prisão.
Outro ponto é que a monitoração está longe de ser algo banal sem controle. É uma ferramenta potente de controle do Estado. Imagine saber onde você está 24 horas por dia, 7 dias por semana, com várias restrições de onde ir e de horários de circulação.
Por fim, se ficar provado que as regras foram descumpridas de forma intencional, a situação pode ser reavaliada pelo judiciário e a pessoa pode ir para a prisão. Ou seja, parece muito mais uma grande responsabilidade que um benefício, né?
Aconteceu um crime no meu bairro e tem uma pessoa com tornozeleira na vizinhança. Com certeza foi ela.
Dá para entender de onde vem esse receio, mas vamos combinar que não seria muito inteligente cometer um crime com um registro em tempo real de onde se estava no momento, né? As centrais de monitoração eletrônica estão sempre de olho, e se tiver alguma irregularidade, o judiciário vai tomar as medidas necessárias.
Ah, mas saiba, na grande maioria das vezes, a pessoa em monitoração quer seguir todas as regras para ficar livre da restrição. Achar que ela é a principal suspeita de tudo que acontece em volta é uma grande injustiça.
Ficou curioso para saber mais informações sobre a monitoração eletrônica? Acesse o folder pelo link na descrição abaixo.
Through our that are available through our QR code that will be shown on the screen. I am sorry. The National Council of Justice, through the Doing Justice program, has developed many publications in the field of electronic monitoring, which are available through the QR code that is on the screen. Manuals, guides, technologies, and models that associate technical knowledge and reality observed in different units of the Federation along the execution of the program. The products are translated into English and Spanish, and they are available to be publicized with the potential to change the reality immediately once the knowledge contained therein is applied. In order to make the presentation of the next panel, we invite as the mediator the public defender of the state of Goiás and advisor of the Department of Monitoring as well as execution of CNJ, Salomão Neto. And as the speakers, the judge of the territory, Fábio Francisco Esteves, the director of social insertion of the state of Bahia, Alessandra Coelho, the activist and researcher in the area of electronic monitoring, James Kilgore, and the researcher and lawyer of the United States, Emmett Sanders. To conduct the next panel, we hand the floor to Dr. Salomão Neto. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. My name is Salomão Neto, and I'm going to start by making my self-description. I'm a black man. I have dreadlocks on my hair, colored dreadlocks, mostly blue. I'm dressed in a blue suit, white shirt, and pink tie. For those of you who are here, I'm speaking from this side. And to open this panel that brings the centrality to the debate of this conference, the theme of selectiveness. I welcome the international speakers, Mr. James Kilgore and Emmett Sanders, as well as the Brazilian authorities who are present here, Dr. Fábio Esteves, Dr. Alessandra Coelho. It's an honor for us to count on your presence here in this event. It's also an honor to count on the people who are with us via electronic mode. It is known that the Brazilian prison system has a very well marked profile of gender and race, composed mostly of black men with low income capacity. What is the predominant profile of people who are under monitoring, electronic monitoring measures? Little is talked about this, and the goal of this panel is to deepen the debate on the theme. Selectiveness that characterizes the criminal justice system is reproduced also in the electronic monitoring. The current panel has as an evocation to deepen this debate and to bring aspects of how this policy application has provoked and caused damage to the most vulnerable groups. Without any further ado, I hand the floor to James Kilgore. And before that, I would like to introduce him formally. Dr. Kilgore is an activist and a researcher from the United States who lives in the state of Illinois. He's the author of six books, and he wrote 4 of them in jail in the United States. He started studying electronic monitoring in 2009 when he was monitored electronically for 1 year. In 2017, he won a Thorough Justice Fellowship to develop a project called Challenging Incarceration in a non-profit organization, Media Justice. This project developed a critical narrative labeling electronic monitoring as an alternative form of incarceration, a non-alternative to incarceration. Kilgore wrote broadly about electronic monitoring, justice, criminal justice, and political economy of the Southern Africa, and provided support to organizations and individuals that work to reduce the damage caused by electronic monitoring. Mr. Kilgore, you have 20 minutes. Obrigado.
Dia a todos. It's wonderful to be here. This is my first time to be in Brazil, and I want to thank the UNDP and the CNJ for inviting us here to speak to you about electronic monitoring. I've been involved in issues around electronic monitoring in the U.S. for over a decade, and I've never really experienced a conference as well organized, grounded in the realities of the time, and willing to take on controversy as this one. My congratulations. I have a special thank you to Isabella Pimenta, who has facilitated us getting here and helping us get our passport and doing all the other things that are necessary to get here, even if it's at the last minute. And I don't want to forget to also describe myself. I'm an older, can I say older, white man with very little hair on top, some brown, some gray, and I'm wearing a blue jacket. So I came to the issue of electronic monitoring when a middle-aged white woman showed up at my house in May of 2009. It was the day after my release after serving 6.5 years in prison. She was very cheery, full of smiles as she strapped a black elastic a black plastic electronic monitoring device to my leg. The next day, my parole agent phoned and told me I would only be allowed out of the house Monday through Friday from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. That shattered my understanding of what freedom meant. I immediately started asking questions about this device. Who made the rules? Who made money from it? And most importantly, what was its future as a method of what I came to call e-carceration, the use of technology to punish and control. So I've been researching EM ever since, and I even wrote a book on e-carceration. So before I go into more details about that work, let me briefly summarize how electronic monitoring operates in the United States, especially so those working in Brazil maybe can determine what parallels and what differences there are. There are four major groups of people who are on electronic monitors in the United States. First is people who have finished a prison sentence and are on a monitor as a condition of supervision. Secondly, we have people who are pretrial awaiting justice in the courts, so-called justice. Thirdly, there are immigrants who are awaiting the resolution of their case. And lastly, there are people whose sentence is actually to be on electronic monitor. We also have smaller groups of people who have maybe an offense for driving under the influence of substances. We have youth and people who are involved in domestic violence. But the two largest, yes, sir. Oh, yeah, okay. The two largest groups of those on pretrial are those on pretrial released and those in immigration. Those are the most rapidly expanding groups as well. The obvious next question would be, how many people are on electronic monitoring in the United States? And the answer to that question is, we don't know. The system of electronic monitoring in the United States is what we can say opaque. You can't see through it. It's totally untransparent and unaccountable. This is the case for two reasons. First, there is no central authority over justice at a national level, no Department of Justice, Ministry of Justice. It's all decentralized. This means that the 2,000 counties that oversee pretrial justice have their own program and their own contract. The 50 states that have post-prison electronic monitoring also have their own contracts. There's no national policy. Everybody does their own thing. And we also don't know how many people are on EM because those who run these programs don't want us to know how many people are on EM. The people that run the authorities that run these programs and the companies that make money from them keep it a secret. We've sent hundreds of requests, public information requests to authorities in various parts of the country, and we've gotten very little response. The last national count on electronic monitoring was in 2015. I think that was mentioned by an earlier presentation. 125,000, very dubious account, and we've never seen the data how they got to 125,000. So we sit largely in the dark about even knowing how many people are on electronic monitoring. We've asked for other data. What's the percentage of black people on electronic monitors? What's the percentage of women? How many people are sent back to prison for being 5 minutes late returning to their curfew, or because the battery on their device went dead? We can't get any figures on 98% of these jurisdictions. So, but I want to emphasize, this doesn't mean we don't have data. We have data. The data that we have is the lived experience of people who have been on the monitor. Their stories, their perspectives. They are powerful, and we use them. That doesn't mean in any way we let the authorities off the hook for accounting for how they spend millions of dollars on electronic monitoring. But from our stories, we know, for example, that black people and those we call Latinx or Hispanic in the United States are disproportionately punished with electronic monitoring, but we have no head count. But we know that in a racist criminal legal system like the United States, every aspect of that system is going to be impacted by racism. So this is the environment that we've been working in for about a decade. When I say we, I'm talking about the challenging e-carceration project of the nonprofit organization Media Justice, which has largely been myself and Emmett Sanders, who you will hear from in a couple minutes. And we've also worked with dozens of other organizations who work with clients and decision makers impacted by electronic monitoring. We also work at times with governmental authorities and sometimes with the judiciary. So I want to talk about the challenges we faced. I want to talk about the challenges we've faced in doing this work. The first challenge is what we call the better than jail challenge. How many times have I told people I'm doing research on electronic monitoring and they tell me it's better than jail? And what I say is that's the wrong question. What is it doing? Is it doing something positive? Many people who are on monitors actually find it more problematic than prison or jail, but I would never say that. But the problem is that we need to be making other comparisons. We need to do better than punishing people by locking them in their homes and making them follow all kinds of unreasonable rules. But I'll tell you, the people who say it's better than jail are 98% of them are the people who have never been on a monitor, who have never had a loved one on a monitor. But if you ask people who have been on the monitor, who have had a loved one on a monitor, I've only found one person who's told me that that electronic monitor did them some good. Everyone else says it's kept me from getting work, it's kept me from interacting with my families, it's kept me from participating in the community, and it's cost me money, and it's cost me all kinds of physical and emotional stress. There's no benefits that people who have been on the monitor can suggest. I think that's very important in terms of how we look at this technology. Secondly, the second challenge was educating the public about electronic monitoring. And we developed a formula for this. Our formula was to circulate the stories of people who have been impacted by electronic monitoring, so that Jean-Pierre Shackelford, a black man in Columbus, Ohio, told me that being on a monitor was slavery, 21st century electronic style. Other people told me that they couldn't go on the front porch of their house, but if they wanted to smoke a cigarette, they had to lay across the door frame with their foot inside and their head outside on the porch to smoke the cigarette. Very humiliating. These are far from the worst situations. I want to just describe one thing that impacted me, and that is my 97-year-old mother phoned at 2 a.m. in the morning. She lived about a kilometer away from me, and she said she had chest pain. She thought she was having a heart attack, and she'd already called the ambulance. And now my natural response would have been to go there, right? But I didn't go there. I went to the phone, and I phoned the number that the parole agent had given me to deal with such situations. Of course, I got an operator who said, well, your parole agent's not available. I said, can I go to the hospital? They said, no, you have to have permission. So this is a dilemma that anyone who's been on a monitor faces if there's an emergency, a crisis, and they can't get permission. Do you address that crisis and hope that it doesn't land you back in jail? Or do you not do anything about that crisis? In my case, do I hope that my mother doesn't die before I have time to get movement permission from my parole agent? I was fortunate enough that my partner was able to go and my mother didn't die. In fact, she lived another 7 years and she got to see me walking around without an ankle shackle on, so that was good. And by the way, we call these shackles, not bracelets. They're not jewelry, so I hope we can change some of that normalizing and neutralizing technology. So those stories make people experience a little bit of what the reality of being on an electronic monitor is. The third challenge was what to do about it. We began to push the notion of rights of people on the monitor, which came onto the agenda last night, right? That we need to recognize people who are on the monitor are not merely an extension of that thing on their leg. They're human beings and they should have rights. And so we studied what the Europeans had put together in terms of recommendations, and we developed a set of guidelines for people on electronic monitors. And we got about 40 organizations nationally to sign them. And we use these as a way to educate people about the denial of rights, but also to promote policy change. So in those rights, we included the right to have movement, to be able to go out of your house, to take care of basic necessities, whether that's doing shopping, doing laundry, going to children's school performances, whatever, being able to have some freedom to move around. We also wanted people to have access to religious services, access to medical care, access to a range of things that in many places in the United States, people were under 24/7 house arrest and they weren't able to go out at all. Give me 5 seconds. So once we developed these guidelines and popularized them, we then had to say, what are we going to do about it? And we began, so, I'm sorry. So what we did is we ended up developing a counter narrative, a narrative that would oppose the dominant narrative, which is that electronic monitoring was helpful, that it was a useful technology, and it was going to make changes in people's lives and in the criminal legal system. So that narrative, I'm going to summarize for you here. We have 7 points in our narrative. The first point in the narrative is EM is punishment. It's not an alternative to incarceration, it's an alternative form of incarceration, one that deprives people of their liberty while offering no benefit in return. Hence, it's a myth that electronic monitors will reduce prison and jail populations. There is no evidence to that effect. They will simply add to the total number of people, as previous speakers have said, who are under incarceration, with some of them being in brick and mortar facilities and some of them being incarcerated in the houses where they live. Secondly, while the technology of electronic monitoring is new, the racialized surveillance and control it embodies is not new. U.S. authorities have been monitoring and surveilling indigenous people, black people, immigrant laborers of color for decades, even centuries. The ankle shackle is but a modern version of the brands that slave owners used to put on enslaved people that they owned. 3, while the ankle monitor may be a simple piece of technology, as previous speakers have emphasized, it is part of the surveillance state, part of a family of devices that monitors, controls, punishes, and captures data on targeted, racialized populations. Its siblings are facial recognition, software, license plate readers, gunshot detection devices, and many others that are going to emerge. Fifth, that electronic monitors don't even do the job they're supposed to do. That is, they're supposed to tell us where people are, but they don't. They cannot even accurately pinpoint the location of the wearer, leading to thousands of false alerts every week. Their inaccuracies threaten the freedom of thousands of individuals at any given moment. They are very poorly designed and implemented technology. I don't know how they continue to be so popular, because if our cell phones worked as badly as electronic monitors, we'd be shouting at each other or talking through strings or something. But fortunately for our communication, but not for surrendering our data to the state, the cell phones do work better. So lastly, I just want to talk about the actions, the responses that we've made in order to address the challenges of electronic monitoring. So one of the things that we've done is we have gotten together with legislators in the state of Illinois, where I live. We've gotten together with legislators and put together a bill that would ban the use of electronic monitors for people coming out of prison. And we got this bill through the lower house of the legislature, And then, unfortunately, COVID came in and we weren't able to finish it off. But this told us that it was possible if we had proper education involving a range of people, people impacted by the devices, lawyers, social workers, etc. If we had that range of people advocating for this, we could make big changes. We also recognize that there's not many jurisdictions where we have the power to eliminate the use of electronic monitors. So this is where harm reduction comes in. And we have to come up with strategies to reduce the harm while we fight to reduce the actual presence of electronic monitoring. So we worked with people in Cook County to develop a pretrial fairness act that would at least guarantee 2 days of movement for people who are on pretrial electronic monitoring. Previously, the majority of people were on 24/7 house arrest. Third, we've deepened the research on electronic monitoring, further exposing the perils of this device. This has been especially effective in the immigration sphere, where the purveyors of this technology have been sending the data of more than 200,000 people to the cloud, from which it's sold then to brokers like LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters, to either law enforcement or to firms that want to use that data to sell goods. The last thing we do is that we put real alternatives on the table. And people have been speaking about this, but we fight to get resources pulled out of electronic monitoring and reallocated to programs that improve the quality of people's lives and offer them opportunities for success in life. As with mass incarceration, those most negatively impacted by electronic monitoring are poor people of color. EM is a racialized program operating in a racist system. We need to shift that. Last night, Minister Cruz asked if we could run an EM program without probation. I have two answers to that. The first is we might be able to run an EM program that reduced harm if we changed the nature of what a probation officer was, if they became support people and not police. But in the United States, probation and parole officers carry guns. They're not social workers. They're not support. And without that, you can't run any kind of post-incarceration program. The second answer to that, my second answer to that would be that we should be involving people who have been impacted by electronic monitoring in doing that work. When I'm not doing research on electronic monitoring, I work in a reentry program in my community, assisting people who've come home from prison, coming home from prison, finding housing, finding employment, and helping them adjust to the transition into the community. People who have been impacted by this are an amazing resource, and they should be supported in doing this work. Instead of putting in people who have a law enforcement background and who see electronic monitoring as a punitive program rather than something that can help people change their lives. So we live in an age where the technology exists to transform the world, to seriously address the issues of racism and poverty by contributing to building communities of prosperity. But instead, we too often focus on using that technology for punitive or military efforts. In the run-up to this conference, I was reading about a new EM technology called Talatrix, which is one of those ones that predicts what your emotional state is going to be. We don't need technology to tell us how we're feeling. We need technology that can transform and address the issues of poverty, racism, and inequality that underlie the criminal legal system across the world. Thank you so much.
Dr. James, muito obrigado por compartilhar suas contribuições. Enfim, a partir da sua própria experiência, que ao falar, nós que estamos aqui no Brasil,
From your experience, and we can see the similarity of how electronic monitoring is treated in the United States, and how, with very little production of data, it has hit our black bodies. So you have made reflections that that talk a lot with our reality in Brazil. To continue, we are going to hear Dr. Emmett Sanders, who's a researcher, a lawyer, author, and co-author of many publications, including Cages Without Bars, Pre-Trial Electronic Monitoring Across the United States, researcher of projects in the challenging and incarceration and unchecked freedom campaigns of media justice since 2017. His work is centered on the experiences lived by the subjects that explore more and more exploit the use of electronic monitoring in immigration and the legal systems in the United States, and the long reach effects that are disproportionate and sometimes devastating of the system, both to individuals as well as their communities. In addition to his work in electronic monitoring, Sanders is a defender of the right of voting of people in incarceration. He has a master's in public relations from the University of Texas, and he lives in Edinburgh, Texas, United States. Mr. Emmett, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and you also have 20 minutes for your talk.
Hello, everyone. So I guess I'll describe myself as well. I'm a black man. I was recently told that I look Brazilian, and I was very grateful to hear that. So thank you very much, Jean Paul. So before I begin, I would first and foremost just like to thank you all for inviting me to come to Brasilia to join you in wrestling with such an important and difficult topic. I've never been outside the United States, so this has been a very unique experience for me and one that I've really enjoyed. But I frankly think that the work represented in this room is remarkable, both from CNJ and from the folks that have joined us from overseas, such as myself and James. And I think that the thoughtful and intentional way that you all approach this discussion is so important. And I'm just really grateful to be here among you all and to be a part of this conversation. So thank you for that. Okay. So for several years now, I've been working in the field of electronic monitoring as a researcher and as an advocate. Part of my current position as a policy and advocacy associate with the nonprofit Prison Policy Initiative, much of this work has been with James in media justice on their challenging incarceration and unshackling freedom campaigns. Through this, I have had an opportunity to connect and provide support to social justice-oriented organizations across the U.S. who are seeking to respond to EM expansion in their jurisdictions, as well as to connect with individuals across the country, across the U.S. who are mostly reaching out, to seek help in just dealing with the lived reality of 24/7 electronic monitoring. And so there are people who I've connected with who call talking about the fact that they're afraid to seek medical help, even though they have clear medical problems, because they're afraid to be reincarcerated. Or people who I've talked to who say, I wasn't allowed to attend the birth of my child. Yes. Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. Or people who have said, I wasn't able to attend the birth of my child because I couldn't get movement to do so. And when I said that this was very important, they said to me, how do we know that it's your child? All right. These are realities that people actually live through. So the work that I do is not simply to understand the usage and the expansion of EM in various systems in the US, but also to better understand the depth and the breadth of the impact of these technologies on people in these systems, whether it's direct impact or it's indirect impact. So people who are impacted through their family member being impacted and the prison coming into their home. So I study and respond to the human impacts of EM and seek to incorporate these experiences into the prevalent narratives surrounding electronic monitoring and to complicate these narratives. Because the simple truth of the matter, and frankly the reason that we're all here, is that this is complicated. This is a complicated matter that we're talking about. It's a complex situation with many complex parts. And the thing that we need to remember is that many of those parts are human beings. They're not just parts, they're human beings we're talking about. And so I also want to acknowledge that I am coming from a very particular segment of society. And so that I wanted to know that there do appear to be some very clear parallels between what we have seen in Brazil and what we've seen in the United States. But I do acknowledge the fact that we are talking about two different states with two different histories and two different complexities. And there are multiple contexts to consider here. So I just want to acknowledge that, because in the US, EM is almost exclusively punitive. It's almost exclusively punitive. It's a continuous carceral paradigm practice that we're talking about, right? And I understand that this is not the case in all places, that in some places there is at least some modicum of support, modicum of social services. That's not the case in the United States. In the United States, it is punishment. It is trauma and it is pain. So the work that I do largely focuses on centering the lived experiences of people who have had their lives affected by electronic monitoring in the United States. People, frankly, like myself. I experienced EM firsthand as a condition of my own release after spending 22 years in prison. I was there for quite a long time. And during my incarceration, for me, the most difficult part was not being able to be there for my family in the way that I needed to, and the way that they needed me. I've said before that I would like to say that during my incarceration that I buried my sister and that I buried my grandmother and I buried my father. I would like to say that, but that's not true, because I wasn't there. I couldn't be there. And so I understand what is at stake. I understand the importance of getting people out and reconnecting them with their families and giving them hope that they can move forward. But I also understand that not everything that glitters is gold, right? So when I came home, I just wanted to reconnect with my family. I wanted to build a life. And I just immediately discovered all the ways that electronic monitoring just completely undermined every aspect of that, every single aspect of that, how it restricted not just my movement, but my opportunity, my ability to engage in meaningful and healthy ways with my family, with my community, and the very society that I was supposed to reintegrate into. And I will say that for myself, coming home, what I needed was support and access. I needed family and community, and EM provided none of this. To the contrary, it actively interfered with all of these things. So I do believe it is important to note here that particularly some electronic monitoring companies and others who stand to profit financially or politically or some other way from those who are monitored, have dismissed the lived experiences of the thousands of people who have been subjected to EM as merely anecdotal evidence rather than empirical evidence. And there are several problems with this. I'm going to just point a couple of them out. With the most glaring, perhaps, is that these are not merely stories that we're talking about. Right? This is qualitative data that we're talking about. This is valid. And frankly, it's not a sound research model to dismiss this qualitative data. It's something that we need to actually take into account the same way that we take into account the quantitative data that's put out there, the numbers and the dollars and all these other things. We need to listen to the experiences of people. These experiences are vital insofar as understanding the landscape, the application, the efficacy of electronic monitoring, particularly among populations that are vulnerable and have been historically and systemically marginalized in the US. Because these are the very same populations that are most impacted by electronic monitoring policy decisions, but they have the least voice with which to speak, right? And so the least opportunity to actually affect the direction those policies take. It's by engaging with and listening to those people who are impacted, for instance, that we get a better understanding of the pervasiveness of issues such as false alarms. In Chicago, in 1 month, there were over 30,000 false alarms. 30,000 false alarms. We have talked to people who have been called in the middle of the night 10 times and woken up in the middle of the night 10 times to respond to a call when they're sitting in their house. And it's these stories, this qualitative data that we're talking about that leads us to investigate these technical issues such as signal drift, or that places people on the monitor blocks away from where they actually are, or issues such as urban interference that with GPS signals, such when you look at the architecture, how it can actually interfere with the GPS signal and, again, place someone where they're just not. And people get sent back to prison and suffer dire consequences as a result of these things. And it's people's lived experiences that lead us to question why are there no medical warnings on these devices? Right? Even though they're known to cause physical harm, we've seen the pictures, we've seen the scars. We know that that happens. Right? There's no medical warnings on these things. And we do, like there are some on SCRAM monitors, the continuous alcohol monitors. These are the very, very similar devices. Why are there not medical warnings on these other things? Why are there not consumer protection laws that we're talking about here? So there's, another reason this data has to be taken into account is that, as James mentioned earlier, there's a startlingly widespread lack of programmatic data collection, evaluation, or frankly, any oversight of EM whatsoever in programs in the United States. And it's largely, as James said, due to our decentralized nature. There's little to compel these jurisdictions to keep record of the demographics of their EM programs, for instance, so that much in the way it's difficult to get an accurate assessment of the overall population of the EM population in the US, it's also very difficult to know who's being subjected to this monitoring, right? So qualitative data does more than just put a face on this technology. It points to places where that data collection is actually needed. And obviously one of these places is in relation to racial selectivity and electronic monitoring. So to this point, however, even in the absence of reliable programmatic data collection, there is a great deal of evidence from which several reasonable assumptions can be made. The first is that EM, which essentially functions as an extension of our criminal, legal, and immigration systems, reflects the same racial and class biases evident in these systems and indeed in the rest of our society. We know, for instance, that in the US, in which roughly 1.9 million people are physically incarcerated in some fashion in jails or prisons or some other form of lockup, that there's a vast overrepresentation of people of color, particularly Black and Hispanic or Latinx people. And you can see here, it's all right there. It's almost 3 to 1. It is very, very definitive. So as illustrated here, white non-Hispanic people have roughly 22% less representation in the carceral system than they do in the overall population of the United States. For other groups, however, as you can see here, there's a marked overrepresentation of in these systems as compared to the representation in the overall population, the most drastic of which being in regards to Black Americans, who have nearly triple the representation in these systems than they do in the overall population of the United States. And this is, I want to be very specific when I say this is far from accidental. This is not an accident. This is not a byproduct of something. This is a deliberate undermining, all right? We know that racism has been encoded into these systems and the criminalization of race has been an ongoing struggle in our country since its inception. We know this. We only need to look at the 1898 Mississippi Supreme Court decision that found that though it is unconstitutional to discriminate on the basis of race, it is not unconstitutional to discriminate against the characteristics to which that race is viewed to possess. Right? And it is this that paved the way for this legalized criminalization of race as a tool of suppression in the United States. And EM is no exception to this rule. It is a continuation of that rule. So earlier, James mentioned 4 buckets or areas where EM mostly manifests. And for the purpose of this discussion, I will just focus on examples from pretrial monitoring because it is where we have more data than some other places. And in pretrial monitoring, which along EM in the context of immigration, it's the largest and it's the fastest growing segment of EM in the United States. It's everywhere. And this specifically refers to electronic monitoring in the context of people who've yet to be convicted and are awaiting trial. So when we look at pretrial monitoring, there are some fairly glaring examples of racial biases to be found. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll highlight two specific case studies where there's actually a good deal of data available. And that's pretrial monitoring in San Francisco, California, and in Harris County, Texas, which is essentially Houston, Texas. So in Harris County, Texas, for example, we see that while white, non-Hispanic, or Latinx people comprise roughly 29% of the general population, they account for slightly less, around 25% of the jail population. All right? And meanwhile, black people, who only make up about 18.5% of the overall population of Houston, comprise 50% of the jail. 50% of the jail are black people. And this is relative in that the same populations who are subjected to pretrial detention are subjected to EM in the pretrial context. These are the same populations that are being monitored. We know that. And we can also see this disparity reflected in San Francisco. So just some brief context about San Francisco. It's been the target of aggressive and rather successful gentrification, largely but not entirely related to the Silicon Valley tech boom of the 1990s. So the big computer chips and all the stuff that goes out. They just pushed people out. They pushed a lot of black people out. And so it went from being around 13.9%, I think in 1970, 1980 or so, to about 5.7% of the population in San Francisco by 2020. But nevertheless, there's evidence here, black people in San Francisco, even though they comprise only 5.7% of the population, comprise 43% of the people who are monitored in San Francisco. This is nearly 8 times the representation they have in the general population. Right? Similarly, Hispanic or Latinx people have nearly twice the representation on EM that they do in the general public in that area. And if you look at the monitoring of white people and the general population there, white people have roughly half the representation on EM than they do in the general population. These are clear trends that we're seeing here. These are clear things. And there are a number of other examples of localities where data has been collected or made available. We can look at Los Angeles, which has a black population of around 9%, but we can look at their EM programs, about 31%. We can look at Chicago, which has a black population of around 23%, but 74% of those who are monitored or in jails are black. All right? Truly, as evidenced by these examples, racial biases are alive and well in EM programs in the United States. So I do want to point this out as well, because I think it's actually important to understand how this thing is sort of spreading. And these are offered 2 really good examples of how EM actually spreads in the context of pretrial in the United States. So from the places where data has been kept, we can see there has been a continued growth of electronic monitoring over the course of several years now. So we look at Harris County again, Houston again, we can see that they had an increase in the EM population between January of 2019 and October of 2021. They increased from 27 people on the monitor to over 4,000 in the space of a little over 2 years or so, a little under 2 years or so. And much of this increase was the result of the O'Donnell consent. It was a court decision in Harris County, which essentially was intended to end the practice of pretrial detention for misdemeanors, for lowercase crimes, which did result in like a lot of overcharging and these other things like that. But it also very much resulted in an increase in these electronic monitoring program in Harris County. Over the same course of time, however, the jail population that is 50% black dipped only slightly. All right? And by October of 2021 had surpassed the jail numbers that were in January of 2019. So what's happened in this case is we can see, and it's the same thing in San Francisco, we can see in Houston here how rather than decarcerating, what's happened is we've only increased the number of people who are under state supervision. And it's gone up to like 13,000 now by the end of that time. And again, same thing has happened in San Francisco, where you went from 60 people in 2016 to 1,659 people in 2021, largely in the wake of the Humphreys decision, which is another thing. So that's just a brief overview of some of the issues we see with EM uses in the U.S. And before I go, though, I do want to point out several key points. There are several things that I do want to say. And the first is that, at least in the United States, EM is responsive to the consequences of human need, rather than to the conditions that actually create that need. All right? We are constantly in this state of reactivity when we're looking at what is happening with crime, and of course everyone wants to be safe, clearly, but we're not addressing the root causes of what's actually happening. We're not making people safer by inflicting more trauma upon them. So, pulling out my stuff here. 1 second, sorry. So that cycle needs to be interrupted. The second point that I'll make is that though there is this myth of tech as this sort of panacea, right? This sort of heal-all for all societal wounds, such as systemic racial bias, and that it can do this because tech is somehow incorruptible and lacks the inherent biases of our society. The reality is that it doesn't necessarily eliminate these biases, but rather insidiously can kind of encode them into the system itself. Right? And so in order to prevent this from happening, there must be a thoughtful and honest examination of these issues and a willingness to engage with these difficult questions on a very human level, because these are very human problems. Which brings me to my third point. I know I'm running out of time, just very briefly, which is that EM and how it's implemented, the manner and degree in which it impacts people's lives, is an extension of societal privilege. In the US, for example, EM is sometimes used as a slap on the wrist for people who would otherwise be incarcerated, generally white or wealthy people. While we look at people who of color who are on EM, and it's being used as an addition and as additional punishment that's being inflicted upon them. Or in situations where they might not be detained. And finally, though it's often positioned to, EM cannot take the place of social services or direct support. It cannot take the place of community. It cannot take the place of people. It can't do that. The very simple truth behind this is that, like incarceration, EM disconnects people from each other. But people need that connection in order to develop social responsibility, and they need support in order to do the right thing that you want them to do, and to recover, frankly, from the trauma that is incarceration. And I'll close with that, and apologies for running over, but thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Dr. Emmett, por compartilhar conosco sua pesquisa, sua vivência, sobretudo, a sensibilidade em tratar da questão, pela própria vivência e as reflexões tão importantes que se extraem da sua fala. Dando seguimento à mesa, passo a palavra para dialogar conosco agora, trazendo uma perspectiva nacional, ao Dr. Fábio Esteves, de quem sou um profundo admirador e não vou perder a oportunidade de falar isso nessa mesa, e também terá 20 minutos para sua explanação. Dr. Fábio Esteves é graduado em Direito pela Universidade Estadual de Mato Grosso do Sul, mestre em Direito pela Universidade de Brasília, doutorando em Direito pela Universidade de São Paulo, tem especialização em Direito Constitucional pela ABD Const e MBA em Programação Neurolinguística e Liderança de Alta Performance. É juiz de Direito do Tribunal de Justiça do Distrito Federal e Territórios, atualmente exercendo o cargo de juiz instrutor do gabinete do ministro Edson Fachin no Supremo Tribunal Federal. É professor de Direito Constitucional e de Direito Administrativo na Escola da Magistratura do Distrito Federal. Ex-presidente da Associação dos Magistrados Brasileiros, cofundador do Encontro Nacional de Juízes e Juízas Negros, ENAJUM, e do Fórum Nacional de Juízas e Juízes contra o Racismo e todas as formas de discriminação, FONARJURD. É também co-criador do projeto Falando Direito para Educação e Cidadania, presidente da Comissão Multidisciplinar de Inclusão do TJDFT, membro da Comissão de Juristas da Câmara dos Deputados para revisão da legislação antirracista, membro da Comissão para a Promoção da Igualdade Racial no Processo Eleitoral do Tribunal Superior Eleitoral e foi presidente da Associação dos Magistrados do Distrito Federal, nos biênios de 2016 a 2018 e 2018 a 2020. Uma honra ouvi-lo.
Obrigado. Eu vou promover aqui também a minha auto e audiodescrição. Sou um homem de pele preta, tenho cabelos crespos que estão cortados baixos, uso barba com um cavanhaque um pouco destacado, tenho os lábios grossos, nariz achatado, sobrancelha um pouco mais fina, 1,80 m de altura, 80 quilos, estou usando um terno azul escuro, uma camisa cinza e uma gravata azul, listrada de um azul um pouco mais escuro, né? Cumprimentar a mesa, uma mesa que me dá muita alegria, não é todo dia, que no Conselho Nacional de Justiça, aliás, que não é dia em qualquer instituição, que há espaço de poder, que circula poder, que uma mesa tem tantas pessoas pretas como a de hoje.
We have today to discuss a topic that is extremely important. So we need to discuss technology, and people think that black people don't have a lot of knowledge about technology, but we can talk about so many things. So we have Professor James and Tamin giving a overview of the monitoring, electronic monitoring. And professors, it is important to register that racism is not the same in all the countries. Like Nelson Rodrigues used to say in 1957, as people say that our racism is different from the racism that occurs in the United States with the conditions that it exists. It's a little bit different, and it's not less worse, because our racism is humanistic. It's a little bit polite. It has a infiltration. It has a technology in a way for us not to have an appropriation of it such in a strong way like in the United States. And speaking of technology, Professor James and both professors actually registered that it produces a amoral type of racism, because it seems like algorithms would not produce racism. But in here, we have Mina da Hora, Tarcísio, so many scholars that on this topic that show us with a lot of property how much the algorithm can be racist, and how the artificial intelligence is also biased and can obviously and has the chances of impacting the electronic monitoring. So it is also important for us to contextualize here, because we have invitees here, how our society is structured in racism and how that is going to definitely talk about the institutions functioning and how the system of justice operates in this logic. And of course, it gives us a lot of reflections about the electronic monitoring and the electronic monitoring of people. And here in Brazil, it has a very benevolent type of understanding. Before the imprisonment, we have the electronic monitoring. We think about it this way. We're very condescending. We're creating a process of this imprisonment, but not always this type of thought is true. And this electronic monitoring issue, it's not so positive all the way through when it goes against the incarceration. But let's say that to our friends here today, that after slavery in Brazil, It is, instead of having a public policy to introduce this population that would have had the greatest slavery regimen in the world, it will receive as a public policy the penal code, the penal law. And we need to remember that. So, not only did we end this process after 1888, we also changed the regimen, the promise to democracy, and so on. So our society at the time abandoned any type of regulation, this transition to the slavery, to the free labor, and it's going to bat in a penal code. So it's important to register that in our history, when we launch a new regimen, a new system of government, a new model of state, before we approve a constitution, we are going to approve a penal code. So the constitution is from 1981, or actually 1891, and it came 2 years after the slavery ended. So we criminalized culture, religion, and freedom. There was a provision in our criminal code or penal code from 1891, the African religions, and capoeira, which is a crime that could even lead to 6 months of imprisonment if anyone could be doing that in the streets. So in 1941, we changed the code, this norm, and transferred 2 of these crimes to the criminal contraventions that are going to substitute to this current day, but we're going to operate in the same way. So racism is very technological. It's just going to change its way of being thought. Nowadays, we have the same legislation that we used to have. In a recent law called War Against Drugs, that is against black people specifically, 28% of our prisoners were of people that were condemned regarding trafficking drugs, and the percentage of blacks are much bigger than the rest, and then the 67% of our prisoners are declared black or mixed race, and our population has 56% of people that are self-declare as black and mixed race. And the system of justice counts with only 12% of them that declare black or mixed race. And the numbers help us reflect about this topic. So in this prison system, there is a racial component that is a huge challenge for our courts in Brazil. And this challenge, it needs to be understood regarding how it's being faced. We know that for a long time, Brazil being Brazil, and we know that it has a racial profile in its responses to the society. It didn't start last week or the last decade. This mass use of incarceration in Brazil. Now we have a solution to this incarceration that is very expensive and that doesn't give a response to the society. And it seems that the solution to this incarceration through the monitoration, to the electronic monitoring, can be a solution to people. But we need to analyze the impact that this can have to the black community, because it can seem to us that this make people stay in their homes, and Professor Emmett and Professor James talked about the issues, but this is very different from people that live in Leblon with this electronic bracelet than a person that lives in a favela or in a way in a very low income history, another social context to be electronic monitored. So we need to face some facts, the component, and we're going to see today that we're not going to have difficulty recognizing that people have the possibility of receiving the electronic monitoring independently from the color of their skin. And if we look, for example, a sub-representation of black people, Belém, Fortaleza, with 100% of the people that are being monitored who are black. So we are, in a way, putting these people in this monitoring. And my worry was that if, in a way, we would choose, for example, people that wouldn't be monitored, my first thesis is not concluded. And this worries me. Why? Because in this country, when we have this vocation of having an imprisonment only of black people, it's a type of social control. And if today we get the numbers of the cities that are being studied, we have numbers in 7 of them. Belém, Fortaleza, Belo Horizonte. And if you get these cities, the percentage of black people in the cities in regards to the incarcerated people is 76%. 2 of those have 100% of them being black. So for the first time, we could think that in the first time of the legal system, the black people are being removed from the are relieving the imprisonment and going to the electronic monitoring. But we cannot believe that if this technology is giving us this number, it's because there's something there for us to look, which seems to be more efficient in terms of social control, in terms of racial control of this population. And so we're going to have some data that demonstrate that this electronic control, this technological control, that is a racial control, in my point of view, is more powerful than the imprisonment control, because now I can know exactly, like my professor, that the professor has, both professors have said, we have a lot more control over the person than in the prison, because sometimes we can lose this person's control at a moment within this mass. Sometimes we do not have an observation of this individual, but now I have that because I know where he is, where he's going, who he speaks to. In fact, I can hinder him from doing so many things, and there's an argument of having a benefit of this control, extending this control, creating more conditions to this context, and talking about how much that can control this population. So when we imagine, for example, that we have a solution, for example, that can promote this disincarceration of the population, I like to remember dozens of people in a society that we have had certain policies that were anti-racist, but that were actually resignifying the technologies of the racism. So we have several of them. Let's remove here the part of the way that we used to think about the criminalization of the religions. So we create many mechanisms. And the law of drugs, for example, when we don't have other mechanisms, that many times we need to reflect about this, how this impacts the population in general, and some other things. And without thinking about this control, and if we think that this is a benefit that can broadly be used, going back to the subject of the person that is in a good social condition and the other person that is in a bad social condition, I'm not only going to impact this person's life, but the whole family's lives. So the black body is already discriminated and read and violented just for being black. And with this electronic a tag to exercise his competences in a social way, cultural way, etc. There is no competence anymore. And it's not only the fact of the person having a spatial limitation for going to one place and another that is already restrict, but you restrict his life even more. If I have difficulty to employ a black person because of what we have attributed in terms of competences to these black people that are vastly being disassociated in society, that electronic bracelet is even more powerful. So when we think that this electronic monitor here in Brazil can be a way to save people from being in prison, at the same time, we need to think about the different opinions that we have in regard to that. So I worry much more about that. So I have less social control, less racial control, and the person can already think about that. So now it's not about hindering these people from being monitored. We just need to reflect about this. And we need to think that none of this technology is so artificial that it doesn't have a humanity behind it, and that this humanity in Brazilian lands, this component, is indismissible. So if I want to create a disincarceration and an electronic monitoring that is adequate and that attends to the human component, race is something that I cannot forget to mention. To deal with in the Brazilian condition, that is a sophisticated type of racism, humanistic, indivisible, and that sometimes we take them to the imprisonment, but in a different way, in a disguised way, being monitored at their own house. So since we have a technology at our service, we need more and more to not only make it popular, but to really take it to the discussion in regards to technology and race. It's not from today that good researchers have already shown how this racism is also technological and how much we need to create communities and algorithms that can help us working with the different biases. And with this, we have an institutional issue. And I am very happy, very proud of this table today, and I start thinking about who is producing all of these technologies, who is making the decisions, and who is providing all the apparatus that produces this electronic monitoring and its application in the country. Who is doing that? Who is this community that is producing this service? In the system of justice, we can respond that from the different authorities that are in the streets and the oversight of the people that are using these bracelets. All of this is not plural. This vision that contains the races. It doesn't count with that. And I'm talking about the justice system. And here we recognize that. That's why we have a forum called FONAE that can promote black people in this area to have a cosmo view, to understand this phenomena that is done in our society, which cause a lot of inequality in our society. So if we are, in a way, and in terms of monitoring, this is indispensable. We need to produce a community that is plural, racial, for us to be able to produce what we want the most, which is to eliminate what is already common sense and what is already making us feel so bad, which is this selective justice in a racial manner, in a racial point of view. And now we have the opportunity to be able to produce something that can help us so much. So sometimes, is it the same technique? Is it the same process? We have news now, which is monitoring, and we have called many people, international conferences about the subject, and maybe it's the opportunity for us to start talking about this possibility of reflections and also of decision making. Why not? So I have an understanding that the electronic monitoring is a way that sometimes is irreversible. It's a need for many factors that if we don't want to reproduce that, sometimes with a more stronger way, the racism that operates in this execution, we will need to have a racial component in each one of these technologies that we're going to create to monitor people, to reinforce a control that already exists and that already affects a lot of people, the family, the community, all of the context that is here. If you only monitor what the person is doing, where she's going, we are also monitoring a whole community, a family, a household. So if this has a racial component here in Brazil, that is still very hard and very difficult. We have a future that is very complicated to follow, but also we have an opportunity to change that in this construction and this event that we're having today and this discussion that we are trying to make. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this special presentation, your contribution, and brings a lot of reflections about the need of the electronic literacy, about the need of the racial component to deal with the electronic impact, the impacts that it brings to all of the actors of the system of justice from the entrance. For us to continue this dialogue, I would like to call now to speak Alessandra Coelho, who is going to also bring this female voice to the space of debate. Alessandra Coelho has a master's degree in social uh, uh, she is an expert of human rights in the University of Bahia, and she's also a lawyer, a legal educator, current superintendent on drugs and vulnerable groups, embracement and the development of social rights in the state of Bahia. And in this um, management, she has a program called Corra Pro Abraço. Thank you.
Good morning, all of you who are present here. I would like to thank for the invitation. To me, it's a great joy to be part of this moment. It's difficult to speak after all of the talks that we've heard this morning, so I'm kind of anxious, but I would like really to thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank all the people who were responsible directly or indirectly for my arrival here. I'm from Bahia. I got here yesterday. I am feeling kind of cold and suffering with all the dryness in the air, but I'd like to thank for all the kindness and for the care. Thank Isabella and Zuleid. I'd also like to thank the drivers who drove us from the hotel to this venue and also drive us all around with a lot of joy and care. I would like to thank the health professionals, the receptionists, the people who welcomed us, the waitresses and waiters who have been serving water. I would like to thank for those who are responsible for the event, such as the CNJ, for provoking this very important talk and discussion, and of course the members of the table, Dr. Salavão, James, Emmett. It's a pleasure to be on a table that is composed of black people, especially because I'm the only person at this table. So I will speak, and I would like to make these considerations first. I'm going to speak from another perspective. I'm going to speak from another glance. So this is why I'm asking you for your permission to speak about a very specific profile, which is of people who are in social vulnerability. And I couldn't talk about this better than from the standpoint of the Corra Pro Abraço program. Today I'm part of the PRADI, which is the Group of Assistance and Development. But for many years, I was a professional of the front line of this program, supporting people who live on the streets, people who are in social vulnerability, people from the youth from the periphery of the city of Salvador, and also people who go through custody hearing. And it's about these people that I want to talk about through this EM standpoint. So these are the people that are more affected by these issues. It's in these bodies that the reproductions of new technologies of slavery are materialized, and it is in these bodies specifically that in addition to new ways of arresting, there are also new ways of killings, because the prison or the reduction of freedom is a way of killing people. And so when we talk about people who are crossed by many sorts of violations of rights, these are just another way of killing. And we try to work on the front line in the territories, trying to undo a bit of this logic and think about care and freedom, think about ways of resistance and survival to the racism that has, as the doctor said so well, different sorts of strands to hide these bodies and to kill these bodies symbolically as well. So I will try to talk a little bit about the drug policy in Bahia from the standpoint of social development. This Corra Pro Abraço program has been played by our secretary, and this year this secretary was extinct and it became two secretaries in one, the one of assistance and social development and the secretary of justice and human rights. So we were placed in that of social development without forgetting, oh, I should have made myself description first. So I'm a black woman with brown skin. I'm wearing glasses. I have curly hair that is tied at this moment. I am kind of clumsy because my legs are skewed, so I haven't fall over myself, but I'm wearing black suit, bra, and blue shirt that is actually, and black suits that are black shoes that are hurting my feet, and I'm wearing braces. I wear braces. I have a necklace on my neck, golden earrings, and I also have red lipstick. A little bit about this. So Corra Pro Abraço is an initiative of the government of the state of Bahia through the Superintendence of Policy Against Drugs and the Welcoming of Vulnerable Groups that is located in the Secretary of Social Development. And our proposal is to offer care, insurance of rights and citizenship of people who are in the situation of streets, people who were psychoactive substances, youth from the periphery, based on the strategies of reductions of damages. So we do everything that the systems doesn't want to do. So we are a program of damage reduction, and I would like to talk a little bit about damage reduction as a set of strategies of care geared towards ensuring the rights of people. Many people have this idea of a damage reduction only from the standpoint of reduction of drug use, but I would like to remind you everyone that we all use drugs. We're all drug users. We use drugs for many ends: therapeutical, for fun, for to quench our thirst for overcome our losses and frustrations. But at this point, we are talking about people who do problematic use of drugs and who are criminalized from a policy of war that is not a war against the substances but against the people, especially the black people. So starting from this premise that the people who make use of drugs and that the war is against the people, we think about the strategies of reduction of risk as a strategy of care, looking from the standpoint of people as individuals and through the racism that goes through their lives and histories, and through from their histories and demands, we want to care for people because sometimes people do not want to be in this situation, but sometimes they are not able to leave the situation, like we are not able, for example, to stop drinking coffee, as an example. I'm going to keep on talking. Anyway, Corra is a program that rose from the work geared towards people who live on the streets. It started as a pilot program back in the in Salvador Historical Center, and the idea was that it came as another alternative to the flow that was very common of people migrating from the periphery to the streets due to many reasons such as territory conflict or the use of psychoactive substances, but also family issues and mental health issue, and this flow of living from the neighborhood to the city, sometimes back to the place where they lived, was very recurrent, and we want to offer care in the territory. So following a logic that is a little bit different from the conventional services, in which people go to the service, we try to follow the logic of the service coming to the territories where these people are, using the technologies that we consider to be revolutionary because we work on the perspective of bind with affection and care. We sit on the ground to talk to people, and we try to bring the articulation with the local services. The services present in each one of the territories. This program was broadened. Fortunately, today we have new fronts, and I will talk about them very quickly because my time is short. But in the last few years, data is here to prove. I don't like to show slides, but this slide is full of colors, and so I think that they show what I'm trying to say. I skipped a slide, but the focus was to talk about our public. Our public are people who are on the streets, people who are in social vulnerability, young boys and girls who are in the context of vulnerability. Most of these people are men, black, with low school level, people who studied between 2 and 3 years of school. And it is not by coincidence that it's the same public that we talk about when we talk about jail population and the people who are mostly affected by monitoring. I brought a spreadsheet about effective rights. This is just a cut of a team acting in 1 year, but it's more in the sense of saying that we try to take care of many different parts of the life of the person, starting from access to justice, education, insertion and capacity building, access to cultural services. And we always bring this spreadsheet in the sense that the percentage of effectiveness, they are very high, and we need to justify why a program of human rights exists and is so important. This is why the spreadsheet is here in the sense of bringing awareness in regards to the personal investments. In other words, a team that is composed of black people that have the willingness and who believe in risk reduction and bet on the care for freedom, and this is why the effectiveness is high. Today, we are present in Salvador, in Vitória da Conquista and Feira de Santana. The program is turning 10 years now of action in the capital. In Salvador, we have a reference center on risk reduction on population of vulnerability, the first one to deal with this kind of problematic. It was opened recently on the 15th. We are with a unit of support on the streets, which is a small container in which people have access to shower and clean water. We are present in some of the neighborhoods that are marked by high violence, in which where they have community police, and we are also in custody um, with a format of support to people who are under the provision of the state. And we also have a policy of fight against drugs in Bahia, in which we are thinking about the policy against drugs, violence, and issues related to penal justice. And recently, we also, in Feira de Santana and Vitória da Conquista, we arrived to these two cities, but we are also working on the increase and broadening of this program so that we can meet the need of other areas of Bahia. Our goal is that in the next few years we're able to reach the 27 units of our state. So we work with some methodologies that are very specific and that cross-cut all of the strategies of the program, risk reduction, as I said, and now thinking of a broader concept and bringing to our conference, reduce damage has to do to the damage reduction of the electronic monitoring, because for these vulnerabilized groups, the reduction of data of damage is much better than any other alternative. So we think of alternatives following the story of the people. In whatever we are not able to overcome, we try to reduce in terms of damage. Of course, our action is geared towards drug use. We have continuous education, but also we fight against incarceration, unemployment, reduction of home violation, domestic violence, and all kinds of violence that come from drug use. So another technology that we use in monitoring is art and education. So it's not by chance that our slides is very colorful. But we understand that art is a way of care. So we bring this technology to the territories, on the streets, on the neighborhoods, and we try to do that in the custody hearing with a more careful and playful care, in which we can talk about painful issues, because to the population who live in this place, we need to talk about pain, because pain is the rule. We need to talk more playfully, more lightly, but this can also shape the citizen in terms of politics. And we also talk about education, which is a very good technology for those who work with the youth. So we have been creating multipliers, and many of them are occupying a lot of space in the marketplace, and we want to offer more opportunities than prisons and deaths. We have access to justice, a strategic point of care, because we understand that even though this is a constitutional right, there is a big abyss between poverty and justice. The buildings themselves are extensive, our clothes are extensive. Our vocabulary is not accessible to people who do not study law. In these spaces, conveniently, this abyss is even bigger. So we think about some solutions to overcome these losses, and in this sense, we work with a technology that is very specific that we call legal popular education. It's well known in other spaces. I am the first legal educator of the program, which makes me very proud. But our idea is that people can come close to this reality without having to be shackled. So we try to bring to the territories a little bit of this translation of this legal language in the translation of these technologies that the justice system operates with. And we also try to situate people in these places where they are. It is not by coincidence that the same audience or the same public is the public that they have pending issues with the law. They have been arrested 1, 2, 3, 115 times since they were children. So people come and go from the justice system and the social educative system without knowing very well how things work. And many times this unknowingness generates these recurrences. So we try on the street to explain what each action means, what that paper that the officer gives to you mean. Many times they think it's the police. So we need to explain what this monitoring brings, all the rules and all the bottlenecks, what people need to do in order to not be incarcerated. We follow people in the hearings. We follow people so they can go to the hearings whenever they have to. So as much as we can, we try to avoid that violations of the EM happens, which is very difficult, especially in these territories on the streets. So I've brought you some bottlenecks because we understand, in fact, that in the front line, it could be a technology that will bring more vulnerabilities. So we talk about other measures other than imprisonment, especially to people who are on the streets. It is not a indicated measure, but sometimes the judge themselves in the decision making, they don't know that this person is on the street because the person is going to be afraid to say they don't have an address. The person may think, actually the person will think, I'm not going to be located, so the judge is not going to release me. So people who have been on the streets for 20 years, people have been on the streets for 10 years, they still give their home address. They will not be located to receive um, any sort of punishment. The judge may think that that is a viable option, and so these people leave with the shackle, with a restriction of territory, with an order for curfew when the person doesn't even have a home. So this person cannot be restricted in a territory. This person cannot charge the shackle every day. The person is exposed to rain. This week in Salvador, it rained every day. So how can people be on the streets with an equipment being wet every day by the rain? The youth of the periphery that leaves the places to do their hustles, we call them hustles. So people to their hustles, they do go their hustles under the rain to sell their stuff on the street lights. They will not be able to keep this life. In order for people to leave, they need to have a telephone registered. Most of our audience, most of our public does not have a phone, do not have a charger. They do not have clothes to hide their shackles in their legs to look for a job without or to enter the slums without seeming like they're carrying a sort of tracker. So we have a technology that can be used very positively, but that in the front line, it is more of a stigma in people's life. As for the women, the doctor spoke yesterday, Dr. Rogério talked very well about this issue. Women, they are hit more by the penal law in many ways, whether by the incarceration of their children, their spouses, or their brothers. And when they are hit by, they are hit by the drug on war more effectively. And when they have children, this solution comes as a way for them not to be arrested, but this woman is going to be trapped because she's going to carry a symbol of imprisonment in their legs. So what do we try to do in our program? Well, we try to think of strategies of reductions of damage of this measure. So what can we do in this sense? We need to adapt our reality to this technology, which is new. It's new, at least in the front line. We try to dialogue with the stakeholders of the justice system all the time in the sense of think about other possibilities. And so I will go very quickly here. The things that we do, so today we have the Reference Center of Reduction of Risk. Maria Lucia Pereira. Maria Lucia was and is the great name when it comes to people on the streets. She was the national president of the movement of people on the streets that has a great history in the fight. She's well known in Bahia and all over the world, so this is a way of paying tribute to this amazing woman. But in the Reference Center, which is an umbrella space in which we end up embracing other strategies of the program, we have the SEG of the program, we have the base, we have a place and a reference center in which people can use for the processes, within the processes, even for people who do not have a housing. So we try as much as we can to indicate our address as the reference address and how people can be located in case they need to receive a call from the police or if they need to receive other sorts of things. So we want to offer other alternatives other than EM. We also have an observatory, so I'm not going to take much of your time, and my time is up. So we have a nucleus of social inclusion that thinks about this care from the work standpoint, because the shackles, they don't have access. So with the leg in their, the equipment in their leg, it's much more difficult. So we need to think of our strategies of thinking about the economy and other ways of executing the work that are possible for these people, especially in regards to the formal market, since they are people who have low scholarity. But we need to talk with this informal network through the Office of Employment and through the contact with the companies to think about of other possibilities. We also work in the custody hearings. We work through a cooperation process since 2015, so we have a team there supporting people and trying to do this service and think about the possibility of measures, and also in a way that they do not return to prisons at people who are incarcerated and people who have been caught in the act. So we work in the sense of providing legal service, also in the specificity of the provisionary measures, and also with constant dialogue, also with the prosecutor's office, with the monitoring center, with the multi-disciplinary team that works with us. I've also talked about the action on the streets. I mean, the program is a big articulator on this on the network. We do not replace any service of the network. As for justice, this is what we've done with a lot of intention and attention in a process of raising sensitivity but also exchange, because we understand all of the vulnerabilities that the system has, and we try to impress part of this necessity of thinking about an attention that is more personalized, because everybody has a different story, everybody has a different level of vulnerability, and problems are more challenging, varies in terms of challenge from one person to another. I've brought some images of the process of cultural appreciation in which we bring people to the beach, to the theaters, to museums, pictures of our activities in the field, on the streets, and we have two restrooms that people use for showers, and also they use the toilet. A women's round, when we think about other ways of caring and other possibilities, and sometimes the idea of caring comes to this round with women because we have care starting from our own experiences. So we think about the voices in our heads. Sometimes we try to impress the voices of our heads in other people's heads without thinking about people's story from their own stories. And to answer some of the provocations, this is it. I mean, we need to think about the reconstructions of other structures of care, also reducing the damages of these EMs and strengthening the work of our professionals in the front line. So we need to think about these things. The CNJ guideline, is it being followed? We need to think about other ways or other measures, other possibilities other than conventional ones. We need to think about the technologies that we could use that are not necessarily incarcerations. We need to think of other ways of caring and providing freedom. We are evidence of that in Bahia. We have sought to, through our program, really decrease the returns. So there are people, for example, that until 2013 and 14 could spend 4 months out of prison, and today we have people who haven't gone back to prison for 6 years except for previous sentences, because justice does not forget other people's past. I apologize for going over my time, but I would like to bring a provocation of some specific case, and I'll go over them very quickly just to leave some provocations of the things we experience. There are many things, but just to reduce, I will mention two, all right? Logically, the names are changed. So we have Isabella, for example, who is a black woman who's 28 years. She has 6 children. She and her children were expelled from the territory because of conflict with the traffickers, and she was sent to the streets. She used to work on street lights. At some point when she was disorganized, she would leave their children in the healthcare center, and then she would go make use of drugs. She had strong bonds with her children. Her spouse was arrested in 2017, and he was a provider for the family. And as a result, she was arrested. 4 months later, she was released. We tried to follow all of her actions, all the hearings that she has to sign, but there was another conflict in the territory where she was, and she disappeared. And it was right in the moment that she received her sentence. 6 years semi-open. The prosecutor, the defense appealed, but she wasn't found. Isabella couldn't enter the court to receive her sentence. There was a sentence. She was recognized via facial recognition in December of 2022. She couldn't tell anybody. She had her 6 children. During the detention control hearing, the judge listened to her, but she couldn't leave because she didn't have a phone. The program had been interrupted, and this is why we didn't hear about her arrest. Isabella spent 1 month without any news about her children. Her children didn't know she was alive until somebody got in touch and called us. And so, this is just a case. I will mention just another. And I know that I have gone over my time. There's also Luis, black man, 43, 3 children. He's been the provider of the family for all his life because he has a child with physical disability. He lives in the periphery. He's always used the streets as a way of self-employment. We consider him a street person because he uses the streets as a place of employment and sociability. He was arrested as a drug dealer, but he was actually a user. He was arrested with 15 rocks of crack. He was sentenced to 6 years. During the process, before the condemnation, he was released and he was free for 6 months. So he left with some precautionary measures, among them EM. It was very difficult to follow this measure because he's a street vendor who would leave the streets looking for places where he could charge his anklet or his shekel. Whenever he was on the streets, he couldn't go back to the neighborhood because there was a curfew on the neighborhood. Sometimes he couldn't enter also because of conflicts such as gunshots and other issues, invasions of the police in his territory. On the last day before his hearing, he asked to do a consultation. He had an outstanding arrest because he had violated his EM rules 183 times. I have 25 cases. I just mentioned 2. This is a reflection only to make us think about how the system is working, and I apologize for going over the time allotted. Thank you.
We would like to thank you, Ms. Alessandra, for your speech. Not only talk because of the gay black man was mentioned here and all of the programs that you have here in the program Corra. I thank you all in the table, the speakers, and I am sure that all of the speeches here contributed very much for the qualification of the debate about the EM, and because of the time, and since we have to eat lunch before going to the second part of the international conference, I would declare the table closed. Thank you so much for the speeches, and now we're going to have the lunch break. The program of the event comes back at 2 p.m. with a panel, the home prison and electronic monitoring, the practice dysfunctions.